Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. I'm Robert, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they are essential to help the channel grow and allow me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let us dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The dawn that broke over Zambia's Kafue National Park on October 11th, 2016, felt like any other in that vast, untamed wilderness. A symphony of unseen life hummed through the humid air as the first fingers of sunlight stretched across the savanna, painting the acacia trees in brilliant shades of gold and amber. For Dr. Lawrence Larry Rudolph and his wife of 34 years, Bianca, this was their final morning of a 2-week hunting expedition. They were seasoned veterans of the African bush. Their home in Pittsburgh seemed a world away from the raw, primal beauty of the safari. Their shared passion for big game hunting had carried them across the globe, and this trip was meant to be another highlight, a chance for Bianca to add a coveted leopard to her collection of trophies. Larry was a charismatic and wildly successful dentist who had built an empire back in Pennsylvania. His face, familiar from local television commercials, projected effortless confidence and charm. He seemed like a man who had it all: wealth, a thriving practice, and a beautiful wife who shared his adventurous spirit. Bianca was equally at home in the wild, a fierce hunter in her own right, a true partner in his pursuits. To any outsider, they appeared to be a power couple, living a life of excitement and luxury that most could only dream of. Their cabin at the hunting lodge was a rustic outpost of comfort amidst the wilderness. Packed bags and equipment cases lay in organized disarray, silent testament to their imminent departure. The trip had been a success, filled with the thrill of the chase and the quiet satisfaction of evenings spent under a canopy of stars, far from the demands of their life back home. But as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the dusty ground, the tranquil atmosphere inside their small cabin was about to be shattered forever. A single deafening blast would rip through the morning calm, a sound that would echo across continents and through years of investigation, carrying with it a story of betrayal, greed, and murder. Larry Rudolph told authorities he was in the bathroom when he heard the gunshot. He claimed he rushed out to find a scene of unimaginable horror. His wife, Bianca, was on the floor, bleeding from a devastating wound to her chest. A 12-gauge Browning shotgun, one of the firearms they had brought for the hunt, lay nearby. His account was one of frantic panic and tragic accident. He said Bianca must have been packing the gun into its soft case when it discharged. Sobbing, he reportedly cried out, "What am I going to tell my children?" and spoke of taking his own life in his grief. The local game scout, Spencer Kakoma, who had accompanied the couple on their hunts, was one of the first on the scene. He was met with a chaotic and devastating sight, but questions immediately began forming in his mind. He was adamant that after their final hunt, all firearms had been unloaded and made safe, a standard and non-negotiable procedure for experienced hunters. How could a gun he knew to be empty suddenly fire? Zambian law enforcement conducted a swift investigation in a remote location with limited forensic resources. Faced with a seemingly straightforward, albeit tragic, explanation from a distraught husband, they quickly reached a conclusion. Bianca Rudolph's death was ruled an accident, the result of a self-inflicted gunshot while packing her weapon. For Larry, this official ruling provided a path forward. He quickly made arrangements for his wife's body to be cremated in Zambia, a decision that would later raise significant red flags for investigators. With a death certificate citing an accidental discharge and an urn of ashes, Larry Rudolph returned to the United States as a widower. But the story did not end there. Back in the U.S., a close friend of Bianca's was deeply unsettled. She knew that the Rudolph marriage was not the idyllic partnership it appeared to be. She was aware of Larry's long-standing affair and the verbal mistreatment Bianca had endured. She knew they fought over money. The news of Bianca's sudden, violent death, coupled with the suspiciously rapid cremation, which prevented any possibility of a second examination, reeked of foul play. Trusting her instincts, she picked up the phone and called the FBI. That call transformed a tragic accident in a faraway land into a federal murder investigation. To understand how a successful dentist from Pittsburgh ended up at the center of an international murder plot, one must look beyond the safari and to the complex, often deceptive world he had built for himself. Larry Rudolph was a man of large appetites and an even larger persona. He was the founder of a lucrative dental practice, Three Rivers Dental, and a pioneer in sedation dentistry in the Pittsburgh area. His television commercials, which ran for years, crafted an image of a trustworthy, gentle practitioner who could take the fear out of dental work. Behind the scenes, however, his colleagues and employees saw a different man entirely. Some described him as having a Jekyll and Hyde personality, charming and magnetic to his patients, but often something else entirely behind closed doors. He was known as a smooth operator with the ladies, his natural charisma, a weapon he used with surgical precision. But beneath this polished public persona lay a web of secrets and shady dealings that few could see. One of the most revealing glimpses into his character had happened years before Bianca's death, during an earlier trip to Zambia. Larry filed a disability insurance claim with a shocking story. He'd been attacked by a crocodile while fishing. According to his account, the massive reptile had dragged him into the murky water, costing him a fingertip in the violent struggle. As a dentist, he argued, this injury was nothing short of career-ending, making it impossible for him to perform the delicate work his profession demanded. The insurance company launched their investigation and eventually approved his claim. Soon, Larry was collecting a hefty $30,000 every month in disability payments. But his colleagues weren't buying it. They watched him continue working, seemingly unaffected by the loss of that single digit. Some whispered among themselves, wondering if he might have deliberately caused the injury just to cash in on the massive payout. Whether this crocodile story was truth or elaborate fiction, it revealed something chilling about Larry's character. A man perfectly willing to twist circumstances for serious financial gain. This pattern would later become the backbone of the prosecution's murder theory, and at its heart was Larry's long, very public affair with Lori Milleron. What started as a professional relationship, she was his dental hygienist and office manager, blossomed into something much deeper over 2 decades. Lori became his constant shadow, his partner in everything. Their relationship was an open secret. They traveled the world together, and Larry even relocated his entire practice just to be closer to her. For Bianca, watching this unfold was pure agony. As a devoted Catholic, divorce simply wasn't an option in her mind, but the situation had become impossible to bear. In 2016, just months before that fateful trip to Zambia, friends say Bianca finally reached her breaking point. She delivered an ultimatum that would change everything: fire Lori and end the affair, or she would expose their questionable financial dealings and walk away for good. Prosecutors would later argue that this ultimatum signed Bianca's death warrant. Larry found himself trapped in an impossible corner. A messy divorce from Bianca could destroy him financially, potentially costing him half of his impressive fortune. His dental practice alone was worth around $8 million. Yet he was also completely entangled with Lori, who had woven herself into every aspect of his life. Murder, prosecutors claimed, offered Larry a cold but perfect solution. It would free him from his marriage, clear the path to be with Lori, and most importantly, deliver a staggering financial jackpot. Scattered across 9 different life insurance policies, Bianca's death would shower Larry with nearly $5 million daughter. The FBI investigation, triggered by that concerned friend's phone call, moved forward slowly and carefully for 5 long years. Investigators faced enormous challenges from the start. The most crucial evidence, Bianca's body, had been destroyed. The crime scene was half a world away and had been cleaned and disturbed long ago. This case would have to be built piece by painstaking piece, using circumstantial evidence, financial records, witness testimonies, and whatever forensic science could reveal. One of the most important voices in the early American investigation belonged to the consular chief at the U.S. Embassy in Zambia, Dial. He'd visited the funeral home where Bianca's body lay waiting, and immediately, alarm bells started ringing. After carefully examining the gunshot wound, he delivered crucial information to the FBI. This was definitely not a contact wound. The shotgun's muzzle hadn't been pressed against her body when it fired. His expert estimate placed the shot at a distance of 6 to 8 feet away. This observation shattered the theory of an accidental, self-inflicted wound while packing the gun. The question was obvious and haunting. How could Bianca possibly have shot herself from that distance? Forensic experts back in the United States backed up this conclusion completely. By studying photographs of the scene and analyzing the wound patterns, they confirmed the shotgun blast had come from several feet away. This made the story of her accidentally triggering the weapon while placing it in its case not just unlikely, but physically impossible. With the physical evidence clearly pointing away from any accident, investigators shifted their focus to motive. They carefully documented every detail of those life insurance policies worth nearly $5 million. The first claim was filed on October 31, 2016, just 20 days after Bianca's death. While not technically illegal, this lightning-fast timing struck investigators as deeply inappropriate for a supposedly grieving husband. They also dove headfirst into Larry and Lori's tangled relationship, mapping out the timeline of their affair, and that explosive ultimatum Bianca had reportedly delivered. The defense team fought back hard, arguing that the financial motive simply didn't hold water. They insisted Larry's dental practice was so wildly successful that $5 million wouldn't be life-changing money for him. They also pulled out a post-nuptial agreement from 2000, claiming it would have shielded his assets in any divorce, making murder both unnecessary and extreme. Their argument was simple. Larry was already a wealthy man who had absolutely no reason to kill his wife for money. For years, the investigation continued quietly in the background, casting a dark shadow over Larry and Lori's new life together. They had moved to Arizona, living openly as a couple in a luxury home. To the outside world, they appeared to have moved on with their lives. But the FBI wasn't finished with them yet. The breakthrough they desperately needed came from the most unexpected source imaginable. In early 2020, a witness was enjoying dinner at a steakhouse in Phoenix when they couldn't help but overhear a heated argument erupting at a nearby table. It was Larry Rudolph and Lori Milleron. The witness would later testify that they heard Larry's voice drop to a low, angry hiss as he spoke the words that would ultimately seal his fate. "I killed my wife for you." The defense would argue that the witness had simply misheard the statement. But for the prosecution, this was nothing short of a direct confession, a crucial moment when the carefully constructed mask had finally slipped. Armed with forensic analysis, clear financial motive, the steakhouse confession, and years of meticulously compiled evidence, the Department of Justice was finally ready to strike. In December 2021, Larry and Lori traveled to Cabo San Lucas, Mexico, for what they thought would be a relaxing vacation. The trip was actually an elaborate trap. Working closely with Mexican authorities, the FBI had Larry detained the moment he arrived. He was placed on a deportation flight bound for Denver, Colorado. This location was strategically chosen because one of the insurance companies he had defrauded was based there, giving the district clear jurisdiction. When his plane touched down on US soil, Lawrence Rudolph was immediately arrested and charged with foreign murder and mail fraud. Lori Milleron was later indicted as well, facing charges of being an accessory after the fact, obstruction of a grand jury proceeding, and perjury for lying to investigators about both the nature of her relationship with Larry and the events surrounding Bianca's death. The trial held in a federal courtroom in Denver during the summer of 2022, became a spectacle of high drama.d. The prosecution laid out their case with surgical precision, painting a vivid picture of a cold, calculating man who had planned his wife's murder with the same meticulous attention he applied to his dental practice. They presented damning evidence of the affair, the crushing financial pressure of the ultimatum, and those lucrative insurance policies. They brought in forensic experts who testified definitively that the gunshot could not have been self-inflicted. And they delivered their star witness, the diner who had overheard that explosive confession at the Phoenix Steakhouse. The defense fought back fiercely, attacking the case as a flimsy structure built entirely on circumstantial evidence and wild speculation. They portrayed Larry as a loving, grieving husband being railroaded by an overzealous prosecution. They argued that Zambian authorities had correctly ruled the death an accident, and that the FBI had constructed an elaborate murder theory out of thin air. They presented the postnuptial agreement as concrete proof that Larry had no financial reason to kill his wife, and desperately tried to discredit the steakhouse witness as having misheard the argument. The most anticipated moment of the entire trial came when Larry Rudolph took the stand in his own defense. It was a high-stakes gamble of epic proportions. For years, he had used his natural charisma to build his empire and charm everyone he encountered. Now he needed to charm the jury more than he'd ever charmed anyone in his life. He unequivocally denied taking Bianca's life, sticking firmly to his story that her death was a tragic accident. He explained that he was in the bathroom when the gun went off, and claimed that the time he spent with Lori Milleran after Bianca's death was simply part of his natural grieving process. It was a performance that fell disastrously flat. Jurors later revealed they had actually been leaning toward acquittal before Larry testified. They found his testimony arrogant, evasive, and ultimately unbelievable. The man who had built his entire life on a carefully crafted image had failed to project the one image that mattered most, that of an innocent man. His own words, meant to save him, had instead convinced the jury of his guilt. On August 1st, 2022, after a grueling 3-week trial, the jury delivered its verdict. Lawrence Rudolph was found guilty of murder and mail fraud. Lori Milleran was also convicted of being an accessory after the fact, obstruction of justice, and 2 counts of perjury. At his sentencing, the full weight of the law came crashing down on Larry Rudolph. He was sentenced to life in federal prison for his wife's murder. He also received a concurrent 20-year sentence for mail fraud. The judge ordered him to pay $8 million in restitution to the insurance companies he had defrauded, plus an additional $2 million fine. Lori Milleran was sentenced to 17 years in federal prison for her role in the cover-up. The judge noted her apparent lack of remorse throughout the trial, stating that evidence showed she had been encouraging Larry to commit the crime. In the wake of the trial, the story took another complex turn, this time centered on the Rudolphs' 2 adult children, Julian and Anna Bianca. Throughout the investigation and trial, they had stood firmly by their father, professing to believe in his innocence. But after the conviction, their focus shifted to the insurance money. They filed a legal challenge against the federal government, arguing that the $8 million in life insurance proceeds, which the government sought as forfeiture, rightfully belonged to them as Bianca's children and beneficiaries. They claimed the government should not be allowed to profit from our mother's death. The dispute created a painful and public spectacle, pitting grieving children against the very justice system that had convicted their father. What remained was the tangled legacy of a family torn apart by greed and violence. From behind prison walls, Larry Rudolph continues to proclaim his innocence, as does Lori Milleran. Their appeals continue to wind through the courts. This story, now captured in documentaries and splashed across news reports, stands as a chilling cautionary tale. The wild, untamed beauty of the African safari, the breathtaking backdrop for so many of their life's adventures, became the final, brutal stage for a dark domestic tragedy. It was a place where the ancient line between predator and prey becomes dangerously blurred. where a man, driven by his desperate desire to protect his fortune and begin a new life with his mistress, transformed into the most dangerous creature stalking the bush. That single gunshot that shattered the quiet morning air in Zambia was no accident. A jury ultimately decided. It was the calculated final act in a long and carefully orchestrated hunt. Story 2. The Mediterranean sun bathes Barcelona in golden, forgiving light, a city of architectural wonders and twisting Gothic streets. Life pulses through every corner here, its energy as intoxicating as the sea breeze that drifts down the avenues. But beneath this vibrant surface, in the everyday, yet often harsh world of the municipal police force, the Guardia Urbana, a darker current flows. Here, in the cramped quarters of shared patrol cars, and through the long hours of late-night shifts, loyalties face their ultimate test. Resentments simmer and grow, and passions, they can explode with the devastating force of wildfire. This was the world that Rosa Peral, Albert Lopez, and Pedro Rodriguez called home. They wore the same uniform, walked the same beats, and were bound together by that peculiar intimacy that police work creates. They were colleagues, partners, and in a twisted, ultimately deadly web, lovers. Their story isn't one of heroics or valor. Instead, it's a dark cautionary tale of jealousy, betrayal, and murder that would shock an entire nation and leave a permanent stain on the very force they had sworn to serve. The story reaches its tragic end on a lonely road winding through the Catalan countryside, near the peaceful, man-made waters of the Foy Reservoir. On the afternoon of May 4th, 2017, a column of smoke drew investigators to a horrific discovery. There, abandoned on a dirt track, sat a white Volkswagen Golf, its metal body blackened and twisted by intense heat. Inside the trunk, among the charred and mangled remains, lay what was left of a human body. The flames had consumed it so completely that it was nearly reduced to ash. The fire had destroyed almost everything, but two small crucial details survived the inferno. The chassis number etched into the car's frame revealed the owner, Pedro Rodriguez, a 38-year-old officer of the Guardia Urbana. And buried within the ashes of the trunk, investigators found a small piece of metal prosthetic from a previous back surgery, confirming the victim's identity. Pedro Rodriguez, a man known for his commanding physical presence and complicated past, had been brutally murdered and burned. The investigation by the regional police force, the Mos Dia Esquadra, began immediately. It didn't take long for them to realize they weren't just investigating a murder, but a toxic love triangle that had been festering within the very heart of Barcelona's police force. Suspicion quickly focused on two other officers, the victim's partner, Rosa Peral, and her former lover, Albert Lopez. Rosa Peral was a woman who seemed to attract trouble wherever she went. Born in Balana in 1983, she joined the Guardia Urbana and quickly built quite a reputation. She was magnetic, a woman whose striking looks and confident presence drew people to her like moths to flame. But her personal life? That was a chaotic web of intense, overlapping relationships. Before Pedro, she'd been married to another man, with whom she had two young daughters. Now she was caught in a bitter custody battle. Within the force, her romantic life became the subject of endless whispered conversations. Her most infamous moment before the murder came when she found herself at the center of a revenge scandal. An explicit photograph of her, taken by a former lover and senior officer, was circulated among her colleagues. Para reported the incident, and the case went to trial, though the officer was ultimately acquitted. The incident cemented her image in the media as a femme fatale, a black widow whose romantic entanglements were a constant source of drama. Her lawyers would later argue that this portrayal unfairly turned the jury against her. Albert Lopez, born in 1981, was another officer carrying the weight of a troubled past. He and Perel had been patrol partners and lovers, their relationship a volatile on-again, off-again affair. Lopez was known for his explosive temper. He'd already been convicted for assaulting a street vendor while on duty, and was involved in another controversial case where a man died during an arrest on Montjuic Mountain. He was a man who seemed to operate on a dangerously short fuse, his professional life marked by moments of violence. And then there was Pedro Rodriguez, the victim. He was no saint either. At the time of his death, he was suspended from duty for brutally assaulting a motorcyclist who had driven through a police checkpoint. He was a man capable of violence, a fact that would later be twisted and used in the conflicting stories told by his killers. But he had fallen hard for Rosa Peral. His friends described him as deeply, hopelessly in love. His WhatsApp status read like a love letter. After the storm comes the calm. I love you, princess. He truly believed he'd found his future with Rosa and her daughters in their shared home in Villanova, a coastal town south of Barcelona. He was tragically wrong. The investigation revealed that Peral and Lopez had secretly rekindled their affair behind Rodriguez's back. The prosecution would later argue that Rodriguez discovered this betrayal, triggering a fatal confrontation. The days following Rodriguez's disappearance became a masterclass in deception. Rosa Peral played the part of the concerned girlfriend to perfection, but her performance was full of holes. She failed to report him missing right away, claiming she was busy with her daughters, and simply assumed he was taking time to cool off after a fight. Her behavior struck colleagues as unnervingly calm and controlled. The very day after Pedro vanished, she walked into a lunch meeting with other officers, and Albert Lopez was right there beside her, eyebrows raised among those who knew about their explosive history together. Later, at a small, quiet tribute held at the spot where the car was discovered, she stood there, asking out loud, "What were you doing here, Pedro?" As if she truly didn't know. She even went to her superiors, requesting a bodyguard because she claimed to fear for her safety. They granted her request. It was a chilling performance, carefully calculated to paint herself as the victim. On May 13th, 2017, the act finally came to an end. Rosa Peral was arrested while on duty. Albert Lopez was taken into custody that same day. Once behind bars, these two lovers immediately turned against each other. Their pact of silence crumbled into bitter accusations and blame. The stories they told the judge, and later the jury, couldn't have been more different. Two carefully crafted lies, each designed to pin everything on the other person. Rosa Peral claimed she was nothing more than a terrified victim, a woman forced to go along under the most horrible threats imaginable. In her version, Albert Lopez, burning with jealous rage, showed up at her house on the night of May 1st, 2017. He took Pedro's life, then turned to her with ice-cold menace in his voice. "If you don't help me, I will kill your daughters." She insisted she only helped dispose of the body because she feared for her children's lives. She was a prisoner in her own home, powerless against the man who had just murdered her partner. Albert Lopez painted a completely different picture. He claimed Rosa called him in a panic. She confessed that she had killed Pedro, possibly defending herself after an argument turned violent, and desperately begged for his help getting rid of the body. He maintained he was only an accomplice after the fact, a man whose love for Rosa led him to make a terrible mistake in judgment by helping her cover up the crime. He found Pedro's body already in the trunk, he said. His only crime was helping the woman he loved burn away the evidence. But investigators and prosecutors didn't believe either story. The evidence they carefully assembled told a third tale, not of a single killer, but of a murder planned and carried out together. GPS data from Pedro Rodriguez's cell phone proved especially damning. In the hours after he was killed, his phone, and presumably his body, was taken on a disturbing tour of places he used to visit. A deliberate attempt to create a false timeline and throw investigators off track. Most telling of all, the phone was tracked to a location near the home of Rosa's ex-husband, the man she was fighting in a bitter custody battle. Prosecutors argued this was a clumsy but clear attempt to frame him for murder, hoping to win full custody of their daughters. More evidence revealed Albert Lopez's active role in the planning. Investigators discovered that shortly before the murder, he had been asking around about how to dispose of a body. He purchased the gasoline used to burn the car. Most significantly, he had bought a prepaid, untraceable phone used for one purpose only: communicating exclusively with Rosa Peral on the day of the murder. This wasn't the behavior of a man caught off guard. This was someone preparing for a crime. The trial began on February 3rd, 2020, and the shocking details captivated all of Spain. The courtroom became a stage for a dark drama of passion, lies, and betrayal. Prosecutors argued that Rosa and Albert had executed a calculated plan to eliminate the one obstacle standing in the way of their relationship: Pedro Rodriguez. They presented their evidence piece by piece, building a case that portrayed both defendants not as a panicked victim and reluctant accomplice, but as cold-blooded partners in crime. Outside the courtroom, media frenzy reached fever pitch. Rosa Peral faced intense and often harsh scrutiny. Her past relationships, the intimate photo case, and her composed demeanor were picked apart and judged. The press painted her as a manipulative woman who used her charm to control the men around her. This narrative, her supporters argued, poisoned public opinion and made a fair trial impossible. She was already seen as guilty, she would later claim from prison, before the jury even began deliberating. In late March 2020, after 6 days of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. 8 of the 10 jurors found Rosa Peral guilty of premeditated murder. 7 found Albert Lopez guilty of the same charge. The judge handed down their sentences: 25 years in prison for Rosa Peral, 20 years for Albert Lopez. The additional 5 years for Peral came from an aggravating factor: she had murdered her live-in partner. Both were also ordered to pay €880,000 in compensation to Pedro Rodriguez's family. Years later, they had barely begun to pay that debt. But their legal battles weren't over yet. Both Peral and Lopez fought back, appealing the verdict with everything they had. Yet their efforts crumbled at every turn. The High Court of Justice of Catalonia rejected their appeals. So did the Supreme Court of Spain. The sentences would stand, final and unforgiving. Then came one last, startling twist. In April 2024, Albert Lopez made a confession that no one saw coming. In a desperate bid to secure prison privileges that might help him at a future parole hearing, he finally admitted to the killing. But his lawyer was quick to set the record straight. This wasn't Lopez claiming he acted alone. No, he still maintained that Rosa Peral had played her own dark role in the crime. The case carved itself deep into the heart of Spanish popular culture. How could it not? The story was too shocking, too wrapped in morbid fascination to simply fade away. The Guardia Urbana crime became something more than just a case. It became a cautionary tale without heroes. This is a dark, twisted story of human frailty, of passions that slowly poisoned themselves into dangerous obsession, of a workplace where personal dramas were left to simmer and rot until they exploded with deadly consequences. It's the story of 3 police officers who wove themselves into a web of their own creation, a suffocating tangle of desire and lies that ended with a pillar of black smoke rising over the quiet Catalan countryside. The killers may be locked away, and the legal battles may still echo through civil court, but that one chilling image refuses to fade. A burnt-out car on a desolate road, a silent, haunting monument to a love triangle that ended in nothing but fire and ash. Story 3. The autumn air in Melbourne-Dale, Michigan, carried a crisp edge that late September evening in 2018. The kind that whispered of changing seasons and quiet routines settling into their familiar rhythm. David Carter, A 39-year-old father with a warm smile and steady hands pushed through the front door of the modest home he shared with his girlfriend on Clarion Avenue. Their house was nothing fancy, a single-story brick dwelling tucked into a neighborhood where families raised their children to the steady hum of nearby factories and the distant rumble of I-75. David, with his broad shoulders and easy laugh, had built his entire world around his teenage son DJ. Weekend fishing trips, heartfelt conversations about the future. He was the kind of father who truly listened. He was also the kind of man who fixed things. Cars at work, leaky faucets at home, and wounded spirits with nothing more than a patient ear. That night, as he walked in from his shift at the local auto parts supplier, he had no idea that the woman waiting inside harbored a darkness that would destroy everything in one terrible, irreversible moment. Tamara Renee Williams, Tammy to her friends, was 40 years old and carried herself with an air of poise and ambition. Standing, 5'5" with a sturdy build of around 190 pounds, she kept her black hair styled neatly, framing brown eyes that could shift from welcoming to guarded in a heartbeat. A large tattoo of blooming roses decorated her left shoulder, a vivid reminder of her nature. Beautiful on the surface, but hiding thorns beneath. She worked as a phlebotomist, drawing blood in medical clinics, with a kind of professional touch that earned trust from patients and colleagues alike. Before that, she'd tried her hand as a travel agent, booking flights and dreams for others, while her own life remained a patchwork of connections scattered across cities like Brooklyn and Atlanta. Tamara found her sense of belonging in the Order of the Eastern Star, a fraternal organization tied to the Freemasons. The meetings gave her a network of support wrapped in secrecy, bolstering her need to belong somewhere. To everyone around her, she was simply Tammy, outgoing, resourceful, the girlfriend who cooked meals and shared laughs with David. But beneath that carefully crafted surface, tension simmered in their relationship. Arguments over money, perhaps, or the everyday strains of blending families, unspoken pressures building toward breaking point. David's family knew him as their rock. His father, Elton Carter, a gentle retiree, often recalled how David could light up any room, cracking jokes that melted away life's daily hardships. Elton's home nearby overflowed with photos chronicling David's journey, from gap-toothed childhood grins to the confident smile of a man proud of his role as a provider. David's sister, Tasha Carter Jackson, shared that unbreakable bond. She described her brother as kind-hearted and hardworking, always putting family first. He'd weathered life's curveballs, a divorce that left him raising DJ alone, financial pressures that came with single parenthood, yet somehow emerged with his optimism intact. Jay, navigating the uncertain waters of high school, absolutely idolized his father. He depended on David's guidance through adolescence's countless challenges. The Carters were genuinely close-knit, gathering for holidays and backyard barbecues, where David's laughter rang out like a familiar, comforting melody. Melvindale suited their grounded lives perfectly. This working-class enclave in Wayne County, just outside Detroit, featured streets lined with modest homes and the occasional flicker of porch lights, signaling neighborly watchfulness. As evening deepened on September 29th, 2018, the house on Clarion Avenue settled into an uneasy quiet. David, exhausted from his day, likely kicked off his work boots in the entryway, the scent of motor oil still clinging to his clothes. Tamara, home from her shift, moved through the kitchen with purposeful steps, perhaps preparing dinner or folding laundry, mundane tasks that masked the storm brewing within her. Their relationship had started beautifully, blossoming over shared interests in community events and quiet evenings together. But lately, it had begun fraying at the edges. Witnesses would later remember Tamara's occasional flashes of temper, her quick wit turning razor-sharp during disagreements. David, ever the peacemaker, would typically diffuse these moments with his gentle humor. But something was different that night. Something finally tipped the balance. An argument escalated behind closed doors, voices rising above the neighborhood's evening hush. The exact words were lost to the darkness, but the anger was real and growing. In a moment of rage or desperation, Tamara reached for a handgun, perhaps one they kept in the home for protection, and fired a single shot into David's head. The sharp crack echoed briefly, then gave way to terrible silence as his body collapsed to the floor, his life extinguished in an instant. Panic seized Tamara as the reality crashed over her. David's lifeless form lay before her, a devastating testament to her impulse. Rather than call for help, she made a chilling choice: concealment. Her mind raced through options, drawing on her travel experience and network connections. With calculated detachment, she dragged his body to the bathroom, where the tub became her grim workspace. Using a kitchen knife with a serrated edge, she began the unthinkable task that would change everything forever. The work was methodical and took hours. Her hands remained steady. Years of precise medical work had trained her well, but the emotional weight pressed down on her. Sweat beaded on her forehead as the rose tattoo on her arm flexed with each movement. She wrapped everything in plastic bags, then cleaned the scene as thoroughly as she could, using bleach to mask any evidence of what had happened. By dawn, David's remains were bagged and ready for disposal, far from the home they had shared. Under cover of darkness, Tamara loaded the bags into her car, the weight of her terrible secret pressing down on her shoulders. She drove south on I-75, the interstate stretching like a ribbon through Ohio's flatlands, passing Toledo and heading toward Findlay. Near Hancock County, around mile marker 159, she began her grim work. She pulled over at rest stops and rural shoulders, tossing the bags into ditches and wooded areas along the highway's edge. The interstate stayed busy with truckers and commuters, even at these odd hours, giving her the anonymity she needed. Headlights swept past without pause as she discarded the evidence of her crime. Each bag she threw lightened her physical load, but deepened the emptiness inside her. David's body now lay scattered like discarded trash along the highway route. By morning, she was back in Michigan, or perhaps already fleeing even further. Her phlebotomist's uniform had been swapped for travel clothes, her mind already plotting her escape through her extensive network of contacts. David's absence sent ripples through his family almost immediately. DJ, expecting his father to wake him for school, found the house eerily quiet. Worried, he called his Aunt Tassa. Aunt Tassa, Dad didn't come home last night. From her own home in the Detroit suburbs, Tassa felt a chill run down her spine. David was reliable, the type of man who always called if he was going to be delayed. She drove over immediately, finding the house unlocked with lights still on, but no sign of her brother anywhere. Something felt wrong in the air. There were subtle signs of disturbance: a tipped chair, faint stains on the floor that had been hastily wiped away. Tassa dialed David's phone over and over, each unanswered ring tightening the knot in her stomach. She contacted their father, Elton, who arrived carrying a father's quiet dread, his hands trembling as he searched through the garage and backyard. Where could he be? Elton murmured, his mind flashing to worst-case scenarios born from a lifetime in a city where disappearances weren't uncommon. Word spread through the family like wildfire. DJ's school was notified. Friends began searching everywhere they could think of. Soon, posters dotted telephone poles throughout Melvindale. David's smiling face, looking out from missing person flyers. Missing. David Carter, 39, last seen September 29th. Lost seen September 29th. The community rallied around the family. Neighbors organized search parties along local parks and the Rouge River, their flashlights cutting through the dusk as volunteers called out his name into the growing darkness. Tassa reached out to Tamara, leaving voicemails heavy with concern. Tammy, if you've seen David, please call us back. Tamara's response was evasive. She claimed she hadn't seen him in days, her voice steady but somehow hollow. To Tassa, something rang false about it all. This was a couple who texted constantly and shared meals together daily. Suspicion began to flicker in her mind, though grief overshadowed everything else at first. The Melvindale Police Department opened a missing person case. Detectives from the Wayne County Sheriff's Office knocked on doors and interviewed David's coworkers, who all described him as punctual and devoted to his family. 5 days later, horror unfolded along I-75 in Ohio. A highway worker near Findlay spotted dark plastic bags in a roadside ditch. Something about them seemed ominous. Curious, he looked inside, then immediately recoiled in shock. The bags contained human remains, partially decomposed in the September warmth. State troopers rushed to the scene, cordoning off the area as forensics teams worked under floodlights. Over the next several hours, more bags surfaced nearby, piecing together a gruesome puzzle. The remains all belonged to a single adult male. Dental records and fingerprints confirmed everyone's worst fears: David Carter. The discovery stunned investigators. The brutality suggested intimate knowledge of the victim. This felt personal, like a vendetta. Melvindale police quickly made the connection, with the timeline aligning perfectly with David's disappearance. The medical examiner later revealed a single gunshot wound to the head, further confirming the intimate nature of this crime. Under police scrutiny, Tamara's carefully constructed facade began to crack. When officers visited the Clarion Avenue home, she was gone, vanished like a ghost. Her belongings were sparse, drawers left half empty. Neighbors recalled seeing her car pull away abruptly just days after David's disappearance, heading south toward the highway. Phone records revealed calls to contacts in New York and Georgia. Her Eastern Star affiliations provided a web of potential safe havens across the country. Detectives began piecing together her escape route. By mid-October 2018, she had crossed state lines, perhaps to Brooklyn, where her family ties ran deep, or to Atlanta's bustling anonymity. Her background as a travel agent had equipped her perfectly for evasion. She knew about fake identification, bus tickets, and cash withdrawals that would leave no digital trail behind. The house yielded crucial clues for investigators. They found trace amounts of blood beneath the bathtub and discovered a missing knife from the kitchen block. David's wallet sat untouched on the dresser, suggesting this wasn't a robbery, but a calculated, cold-blooded murder. On December 20th, 2018, Wayne County's 24th District Court issued a felony warrant for Tamara Renee Williams, first-degree homicide, disinterring a dead body, tampering with it. The charges painted a chilling portrait of cold deliberation, the horror extending far beyond the killing itself. Us marshals joined the hunt, elevating the case to major status in 2021. Their fugitive task force scoured databases for digital footprints, airport cameras, hotel registries, social media shadows. A $10,000 reward was launched, climbing to $25,000 by 2023, when Tamara claimed her spot on the 15 most wanted list. Us marshals, Director Ronald L. Davis condemned the heinous, brutal crime, urging tips to their 24-hour hotline. The manhunt thrust the family into an agonizing limbo. Elton sat in his living room poring over news clippings, visibly aged, his once steady hands now clasped in prayer. "I just pray that whoever is helping her turns her in." His voice cracked under the weight of unbearable loss. Tassa became the family's voice, her interviews raw with emotion. "She not only shot my brother in the head, but dismembered his body with a kitchen knife. She's a monster behind the mask." DJ, thrust into adulthood far too early, grappled with the betrayal. His father's killer had shared their home, known their routines, their lives. The family quietly attended Eastern Star events, hoping to flush out leads, but Tamara's involvement there became her shield. Her sisters in the order remained bound by loyalty or fear. Community vigils honored David's memory. Balloons floated skyward at the highway site, but closure remained elusive. The unsolved ache deepened with each passing year. Years blurred into tense stalemate. By 2023, Tamara was 44, perhaps altering her appearance, dreads to straight hair, to evade recognition. Authorities warned she remained armed and dangerous, her brown eyes potentially colder after years on the run. Elton's health began to falter, unresolved grief becoming a silent thief. Tessa channeled her pain into advocacy, speaking at crime victim forums about the agony of living in limbo. DJ grew into manhood, honoring his father with a matching tattoo, a permanent reminder amid the void. Melvindale changed around them. New families moved on to Clarion Avenue. The house was repainted, but the scar lingered. A cautionary tale whispered in local establishments. The Eastern Star connection loomed large in everyone's minds. Did her sister shelter her, bound by sacred oaths? Or had she severed those ties, wandering alone through the shadows? The reward money climbed higher. Crime Stoppers added another $1,000 anonymously. As 2025 dawned, the case remained wide open, a cold pursuit in our digital age. Tassa's words echoed through the years. Help us get justice, not just for David, but for our mother, who prayed for it every single night before she passed. Elton Fryer clung to hope, scanning faces in crowds. The highway stretch in Ohio, where those bags once lay, became an unofficial memorial site. Wildflowers now grew over the ditch as nature slowly reclaimed the horror. Tamara's whereabouts remained a complete mystery. Canada, the Caribbean, her travel experience opened countless possibilities. Her rose tattoo, perhaps hidden beneath long sleeves in some distant place. The U.S. Marshals pressed on relentlessly. Task forces raided leads from Detroit to New York, their determination a beacon cutting through the despair. The human toll wove through every thread of this story. David's death wasn't just another crime. It shattered an entire family, leaving DJ fatherless, Tassa forever vigilant, Elton heartbroken. Tamara's continued flight prolonged the wound, her evasion feeling like a second betrayal. In the quiet of Melvindale nights, the wind along I-75 seemed to carry whispers of what-ifs. What drove her rage? What remorse, if any, haunted her dreams? The case, still unsolved as of October 2025, stood as a testament to resilience amid unresolved darkness. Justice deferred, but not denied. Families like the Carters waited in the shadows, their pain a quiet but powerful force, urging the world to look closer, to see the monster hiding behind the smile. Story 4. The coastal town of Vero Beach, Florida, in June of 2014, was a place where manicured lawns stretched beneath endless sunshine. Here, the Atlantic breeze seemed to carry away the world's troubles, leaving behind nothing but peaceful, orderly days. For 26-year-old Diana Duva, this was home. She journeyed here from the small Eastern European country of Moldova, arriving in America at just 13 years old. A young girl who couldn't speak a single word of English. But Diana was pure resilience wrapped in light. Within months, she was speaking fluently, thriving in school, her accent fading until you'd never guess she wasn't born right here in America. Friends came easily to her. Her spirit was magnetic, drawing people in like moths to a flame. She found her calling in nursing, dedicating herself to caring for cancer patients, work that demanded the deep well of compassion she carried in abundance. Bright, beautiful, and cherished beyond measure by her mother Lena and stepfather Bill Andrews. In the summer of 2013, Diana's path crossed with Michael Mike Jones. To anyone watching, this 32-year-old seemed like the picture of success. As a wealth manager at PNC Bank, he handled multi-million-dollar accounts with ease. His charm and magnetic personality made him a regular face at local fundraisers. Well-dressed, well-spoken, radiating the kind of confidence that was almost impossible to resist. When Lena first met him, she couldn't help but be impressed. He seemed, as her husband Bill would later remember, like the perfect boyfriend. Their romance moved at lightning speed. Within just a few months, they were sharing a home. But those closest to Diana began noticing something troubling. A subtle shift that sent quiet alarm bells ringing. Her best friend, Chelsea Dio, watched as Diana's vibrant independence began to fade away. You would never see her without him, she would later recall. And she had never been like that in relationships before. Diana was becoming isolated, her world slowly shrinking until it revolved entirely around Mike. There were lunches she felt she had to keep secret from him, a quiet, gnawing fear that meeting a friend might somehow get her in trouble. The man who was so charming in public was revealing a very different, much more controlling side behind closed doors. The first crack in their world appeared in April 2014. After a heated argument, Diana called Chelsea in hysterics, still in her pajamas, having fled the apartment she shared with Jones. Through her tears, she described how he had screamed at her for hours before putting his hands around her neck. Chelsea begged her to go to the police, but Diana refused. She ended the relationship and moved back to her parents' home, but she never told them what had happened that night. The secret became a heavy, dangerous burden she carried alone. Lena noticed that even after the breakup, Jones wouldn't let go. She would tell me, "He texts me. It's like he doesn't understand that I broke up with him." Lena remembered. His pursuit was relentless, constant pressure that never seemed to end. And slowly, tragically, he began pulling her back in. It was the classic, insidious cycle of abuse, control and violence followed by apologies and promises, as empty as they were convincing. Diana, like so many caught in such a web, found herself trapped in an on-again, off-again relationship with the man who was both her captor and, she was led to believe, her greatest love. On the night of Thursday, June 19th, 2014, Diana went out with friends. But the evening ended with her agreeing to meet Mike Jones at a local bar called What a Tavern. They were spotted leaving together around 1:30 a.m. At 1:45 a.m., a text message lit up Lena Andrews' phone. It was from Diana, written in Russian, the language they shared. Short and simple, she wouldn't be coming home that night. It was the last time anyone would ever hear from her. The next morning, the sun rose over Vero Beach, but a shadow of unease had settled over the Andrews household. Lena had one unbreakable rule with her daughter. They spoke every single day. When Friday morning came and went with no call, a knot of dread began tightening in her stomach. She called Diana's phone. No answer. She tried again. Nothing. Then she called Mike Jones. He answered, his voice casual, almost dismissive. "Oh, don't worry," he said. "She's with me. Everything's okay." As they began digging into his background, the carefully constructed facade of the successful, charming wealth manager began to crumble. They quickly discovered a shocking secret. Mike Jones was not the man anyone in Vero Beach thought he was. He was a convicted felon. In 2012, before he'd moved to Vero Beach and built his new life, Jones had been charged with aggravated stalking for threatening to kill an ex-girlfriend near Fort Lauderdale. He'd pleaded no contest and was still on probation. This wasn't just a red flag. It was a blaring alarm. The man Diana was last seen with had a documented history of threatening women. The hunt for Diana took on a terrifying new urgency. The knowledge of Jones's probation violation gave police a crucial tool. He wasn't just a person of interest anymore. He was a wanted man. The search intensified into a multi-agency effort to track him down. But he had a head start, and he was running. Investigators were running out of leads when Metz and Harrelson decided to take a closer look at the data from Diana and Jones's cell phones. They began meticulously mapping the pings from cell towers their phones had connected to on the night of the disappearance. Amidst all the routine data, one ping stood out. It came from a cell tower 25 minutes south of Vero Beach in the Fort Pierce area, a location that seemed entirely out of place. It was a long shot, a digital breadcrumb in a vast wilderness, but it was all they had. They followed the hunch. Local authorities in that area were alerted to be on the lookout for Jones's gold Honda and Diana's black Nissan. Their intuition paid off. They located Jones's car parked outside a Hampton Inn. Surveillance video confirmed he had checked in. The detectives' hearts raced as they assembled a team to enter the hotel room. "You don't know what you're going to find when you get in that room," Harrelson later said. "Your heart is racing. You've been going 2 straight days, and now you're this close to getting who you believe is a possible suspect, and hopefully finding Diana." Oh. They breached the door, weapons drawn, ready for anything. But Diana wasn't there. Mike Jones was sitting in the room, talking on a burner phone. A disposable, untraceable device favored by those trying to evade the law. He was calm, uncooperative, and refused to provide any information about Diana's whereabouts. He was arrested for the probation violation and taken to jail. The elation of finding him was immediately crushed by the despair of not finding her. You go from very high because you found him and you're busting in the room to like, "Here we are back again," Harrelson said. The biggest question remained unanswered. Where was Diana Duva? Metz and Harrelson went back to the digital trail. The burner phone became their new focus. They traced its purchase to a Walmart in the Melbourne area, about an hour away from the Hampton Inn. They requested hours of surveillance footage from the store, painstakingly screening it for any sign of Jones. And then they found him. The video from the day after Diana disappeared showed Mike Jones walking into the store to purchase the phone. The footage also showed Diana's car in the parking lot. There was no sign of Diana. The detectives now knew Jones had been with her car, and they knew the general area where he'd been. They reanalyzed his cell phone pings and discovered he had picked up a call in the Melbourne area. They alerted local authorities to be on the lookout for Diana's black Nissan. Less than an hour later, the call they had been dreading came in. The car had been found. It was parked in the sprawling lot of a public supermarket. Around 4:30 in the morning, Metz and Harrelson arrived at the scene. The warm Florida night air suddenly felt cold and heavy. As they approached the car, a sickening certainty washed over Lieutenant Harrelson. "And I told Brad," he said. "She's in the trunk." Sergeant Metz, a father himself, prayed it wasn't true. The memory of his promise to Lena Andrews, "I will find your daughter for you," pushed him forward. He approached the back of the car. The trunk was opened, and the desperate search for Diana Duva came to its horrific end. She was there. Her body, lifeless and still, was crammed into that small space. "There are certain things in this job you can't unsee," Harrelson would later say. The trauma of that moment burned itself into his memory. An autopsy would later reveal she had suffered severe head trauma and had been strangled. For Lena Andrews, the news came not as a call, but as a sight that would haunt her forever. She opened the door of her home to see the Vero Beach Chief of Police in his full dress uniform standing in her driveway. She knew, before a single word was spoken, that the worst had happened. "To lose her like this," she said, her voice breaking with grief beyond words. "It's indescribable." 2 days after her body was found, Mike Jones was charged with first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty, but the case against him, carefully built by Metz and Harrelson, was overwhelming. Investigators had returned to his apartment and found tiny, almost invisible droplets of blood on the threshold of his garage door. DNA testing confirmed the blood belonged to Diana. Prosecutors believed this was the final piece of evidence, showing that Jones had attacked Diana in his apartment. then placed her body in the trunk of her car while it was parked in his garage before driving it to Melbourne to abandon it. They also pieced together his escape, discovering he had taken a taxi from the parking lot back toward the Hampton Inn. The trial of Michael Jones finally began in October 2019. Prosecutors laid out the story of a relationship defined by control and abuse, culminating in murder. They called Diana's friend, Chelsea, to the stand, who testified about the April incident, providing jurors with a chilling glimpse into the violence that had been hidden behind closed doors. An appeals court would later rule that this evidence of prior violence was crucial and admissible, as it was relevant to establishing Jones's motive and intent. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial. They suggested Diana could have sustained her fatal injuries accidentally, and that Jones had only panicked and hidden her body. A medical expert for the defense even testified that Diana could have still been alive when she was placed in the trunk. Under cross-examination, however, even their own expert conceded that her death was best categorized as a homicide. Michael Jones, the man who had built a life on lies and charm, chose not to testify in his own defense. It took the jury just 45 minutes to see through the facade. They returned with their verdict, guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. The following month, the same jury returned for the sentencing phase. The prosecution argued for the death penalty, calling Jones a remorseless killer who deserved the ultimate punishment. The defense presented evidence of a troubled childhood, including an abusive father and a traumatic brain injury from his youth, in a plea for mercy. In the end, the jury's decision was split 11-1 in favor of death. Under Florida law, a unanimous decision was required. That lone holdout juror spared Michael Jones from execution. In November 2019, a judge sentenced Michael Jones to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Before he was led away, Diana's mother, Lena Andrews, faced the man who had stolen her daughter's future. For her, the sentence was a form of justice. "He's still going to die in jail one way or another," she said. "He's still going to die in jail, and he's never going to hurt another girl again." The story of Diana Duva is a tragic cautionary tale of the deadly reality of domestic violence. It's a story about the masks that abusers wear, the way charisma can hide cruelty, and success can conceal a depraved heart. It's also a story of a mother's relentless love and the determined work of two detectives who refused to give up. Diana's life was cut short, her light extinguished by an act of brutal, selfish violence. But her story lives on as a stark and powerful warning. As her mother Lena implores, if you feel something is not right, listen to yourself, because something is not right. Story 5. The woods of the Bavarian Alps in autumn 2001 stood like a cathedral of silence. Crisp, cold air drifted through the trees, carrying whispers of pine and damp earth. Along a secluded road near the German-Austrian border, a local hunter made his way through the dense forest, only to stumble upon a scene that shattered the tranquil landscape. A woman's body lay partially hidden among the trees. Her life had been taken with shocking violence that seemed to desecrate this peaceful place. German authorities quickly discovered the chilling nature of this crime. The woman had died from a devastating blow to the head. But the killer, desperate to hide her identity, had done something even more disturbing, repeatedly running over her body with a vehicle. The victim became a ghost, a nameless woman whose story had ended in a storm of rage deep within these silent woods. For 2 agonizing years, she remained without an identity. German police worked tirelessly, but their investigation led nowhere. They had a body and a crime scene, but no name, no motive, no suspect. Days grew cold, a haunting mystery and silent testament to a stolen life and a killer who had vanished without a trace. Hundreds of miles away, in the sun-drenched landscape of southern Italy, a young woman was living a life that seemed the complete opposite of the darkness hidden in that Bavarian forest. Eleonora Salome was 22 years old, a brilliant and beautiful dentistry student with a future as bright as the Mediterranean sun. She lived in a quiet town near Pescara in the Abruzzo region, the cherished daughter of a wealthy and loving family. Her mother, Elizabeth Landsman, was a Dutch jewelry dealer, a sophisticated woman of means who split her time between Italy and her business dealings. Her father, an Italian engineer based in Venice, lived apart from them. But, despite the distance, their love for their daughter remained a constant, steady presence in Eleonora's life. At the heart of Eleonora's promising future was a man named Francesco Alfonsetti. At 34, Francesco seemed the picture of respectable middle-class success. He worked as a surveyor, a steady job that suited his charming, easygoing nature. Handsome, attentive, and deeply devoted to Eleonora, he had been her fiancé for 3 years. Their relationship brought joy and stability to her world. Francesco had woven himself seamlessly into Eleonora's life. He was a regular at family dinners, a welcome face at social gatherings, a man who had earned the complete trust and affection of Eleonora's parents. To everyone who knew them, he was the perfect future son-in-law. A man who adored their daughter and would surely build a happy life with her. But Francesco Alfonsetti was a master of breathtaking deception, a man living an impossible double life. The life he shared with Eleonora in the sunny world of Pescara was nothing more than an elaborate fiction. His real life, the one he returned to whenever he left his adoring fiancée, was in Francavilla Fontana, a town in the Apulia region, deep in the heel of Italy's boot. There, Francesco wasn't the devoted fiancé. He was the devoted husband and father. He had a wife who knew nothing about Eleonora, and 3 children who were supposedly the center of his world. To his friends, neighbors, and colleagues, he was a model man, a pillar of the community, who balanced work and family with admirable, effortless grace. He was a walking, breathing lie, a man who had built walls of deception so thick and so high that no one in either of his 2 worlds could see over them. For 3 years, he juggled these separate lives with chilling, almost unnatural skill. He was the loving fiancé to Eleonora, building dreams of their future together. And he was the devoted husband and father in Francavilla Fontana, a man who supposedly cherished his family above all else. His profession as a surveyor provided perfect cover for his frequent unexplained absences. Work required travel, he would say, a simple, believable lie that allowed him to move freely between his 2 worlds. Between the woman he promised to marry and the woman he had already sworn to honor. But Francesco's web of lies extended far beyond his romantic deceptions. He was a predator who saw relationships as pathways to profit, opportunities for financial gain. And his twisted game was about to become even more tangled, more depraved, and ultimately more deadly. While engaged to Eleonora, Francesco began a secret affair with her mother, Elizabeth Landsman. Datum penisue dates coordo. Edicoanante ederauldes. The glamorous, wealthy jewelry dealer, the very woman who had welcomed him into her family as a future son-in-law, became his lover. The betrayal was absolute, a violation of trust so profound it defied all understanding. But this affair wasn't just about passion. It was about money. After receiving a substantial inheritance, Elizabeth made a decision that would prove catastrophic. Trusting the man who was supposed to become her daughter's husband, the same man she was secretly sleeping with, she gave him 150,000 euro. It was meant as a loan, an investment, a gesture of faith in the man she believed she could trust. That money, like Elizabeth's trust, would never be returned. By the summer of 2001, the affair had turned bitter. Elizabeth, perhaps consumed by guilt, perhaps finally seeing the darkness in the man she'd become entangled with, made a decision. She wanted to end it all. She wanted her money back, and she wanted him gone from her life. She traveled to Germany, and on November 1st, 2001, she met with Francesco one last time. This meeting, taking place in what would be her final days, marked the end of their twisted relationship. An autopsy would later reveal they had been intimate during this final encounter. One last act in their drama of betrayal. But then, the meeting turned violent. Investigators believe Elizabeth demanded her money back, and Francesco refused. In the confrontation that followed, in a moment of pure rage and desperation, Francesco killed her. Then, in a final brutal act of desecration, he ran over her body with his car, trying to erase not just her life, but her very identity. He disposed of her belongings, her phone, her car, and returned to Italy, back to his double life, leaving nothing but a ghost in the Bavarian woods. The news of Elizabeth's disappearance, and then 2 years later the confirmation of her death, devastated Eleonora. Through it all, Francesco remained by her side, a pillar of strength, the grieving fiancé sharing in her pain. He played his part perfectly, his grief masking his guilt. For 2 years, he had lived with the secret of what he had done. His life became a charade of love and loss. Here was a man mourning a woman he had murdered, comforting the daughter of the woman he had killed. The audacity of his deception was matched only by its cruelty. German and Italian police, working together, had finally managed to identify the woman in the woods as Elizabeth Landsman. The investigation into her murder was now in full swing, but it was a case with precious few leads. Then came a breakthrough from an unexpected place. Elizabeth's mobile phone, the one that had vanished with her in Germany, suddenly pinged a network in Italy. It was active, and it was in the possession of a woman in Francavilla Fontana, the very town where Francesco Alfonsetti lived his secret life. When questioned, the woman was stunned. She claimed she didn't know Elizabeth Landsman. The phone, she said, had been a gift from her husband, Francesco Alfonsetti. In that moment, the two worlds that Francesco had kept so carefully separate collided with explosive force. The devoted family man of Francavilla Fontana was now linked to a murder victim in Germany, a woman who happened to be the mother of his fiancée in Pescara. Francesco, once a background figure, a grieving fiancé offering support, was now the prime suspect. But suspicion wasn't proof. Investigators lacked the evidence to arrest him. They needed more. They decided to interview the one person who might hold the key. The one person who had been at the center of Francesco's life, even if she didn't know it. They scheduled a formal interview with Eleonora Salome for Sunday, January 18th, 2004. They hoped she could shed light on Francesco's movements, on his relationship with her mother, on the strange and disturbing puzzle that was beginning to take shape. The interview never took place. On Saturday, January 17th, the day before she was to speak with police, Eleonora Salome was found dead. The circumstances were as tragic as they were suspicious. She was in Francesco's presence when she died. According to him, she had taken her own life, overwhelmed by terrible guilt. He tried to stop her, that he had begged her not to harm herself, but that she had been inconsolable. His story was almost too neat, too convenient. The woman who was about to be questioned by police in connection with her mother's murder, a murder in which her fiancé was the prime suspect, had suddenly died by suicide. It was a tragedy layered upon tragedy, a story that stretched the bounds of belief. The Italian police, their suspicions now at fever pitch, arrested Francesco. But they found themselves in a difficult position. They had a dead witness, a prime suspect with an implausible story, but no concrete evidence to link him to Eleonora's death. He was charged with lying to police, but the murder charge they so desperately wanted remained just out of reach. Francesco, now in custody, continued to spin his web of lies. He denied everything. He offered a story so bizarre, so monstrous, that it could only have been born from the mind of a desperate killer. He accused Eleonora, his dead fiancée, of killing her own mother. He claimed that her death wasn't murder, but suicide, an act of self-destruction brought on by the remorse she felt for her terrible crime. It was a final, grotesque betrayal, an attempt to frame the woman he had professed to love for a murder he himself had committed. No one believed him, but proving his guilt would be a long and difficult journey. With both Elizabeth and Eleanora gone, Francesco was the only living link to the truth. The investigation became a painstaking reconstruction of his life, a journey into the heart of darkness that had been hiding in plain sight all along. For years, Italian authorities worked tirelessly to piece together this twisted puzzle. They carefully unraveled his financial dealings, exposed his secret affairs, and untangled his intricate web of lies. Brick by brick, they built their case on a foundation of circumstantial evidence. Finally, in 2007, 6 long years after he had abandoned Elizabeth's body in those cold Bavarian woods, Francesco Alfonsetti was brought to trial for her murder. The Italian court, faced with overwhelming evidence of his deception, his clear motive, and his undeniable opportunity, found him guilty. He received a life sentence. At last, justice for Elizabeth had been served. But the story wasn't over yet. The haunting question of Eleanora's death still cast its shadow over the conviction. Police had always believed that Francesco killed her to silence her forever, to prevent her from revealing what she knew. But they lacked the concrete evidence to prove it. Then in 2009, that crucial evidence finally emerged. The specific details of this new evidence weren't widely reported, but it was powerful enough. At long last, authorities could charge Francesco Alfonsetti with the murder of his own fiancée, Eleanor Salome. 2 years later, in 2011, he faced a second trial. The court, presented with this compelling new evidence, found him guilty of murdering the very woman he was supposed to marry. The woman whose life he had destroyed to cover up her mother's murder. Francesco Alfonsetti received a second life sentence. The man who had lived 2 separate lives would now spend the rest of his one remaining life behind bars. The case of Francesco Alfonsetti stands as a chilling saga of breathtaking deception and cold-blooded murder. This is the story of a man who was truly a chameleon of evil, a predator who wielded love as a weapon and trust as his favorite tool. Here was a man who could weep alongside his fiancée over her mother's tragic death, all while knowing he was the one who had killed her. He was a man who could stand with his family, the very picture of a devoted husband and father, while his secret life swirled with betrayal and violence. This is the story of 2 women, a mother and daughter, who both fell victim to the same man's irresistible charm and the same man's deadly rage. And it serves as a terrifying reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often those who wear the most convincing masks, the ones who live quietly among us, hidden in the plain, respectable light of day. Story 6. The Nebraska plains stretched endlessly under a boundless sky. A patchwork of golden and brown fields stitched together by long, straight roads. In the heart of this vast landscape, nestled among fields of corn and soybeans, sat the small town of Murdoch. This was a place where everyone knew everyone, where life moved at a slower, more deliberate pace. Here, on a sprawling farm just outside of town, Wayne and Charmanstock had built their lives, a life as sturdy and dependable as the old oak trees lining their driveway. Wayne, 58, was a man of the earth. His hands bore the calluses of years working the land. He was a farmer through and through, his days guided by the seasons and the needs of his crops. Though a man of few words, his quiet strength and unwavering kindness were known throughout the community. Charman, 57, was the heart of their home, a woman whose warmth and generosity stretched as wide as the prairie sky. She was a devoted wife, a loving mother to their 2 children, Andrew and Stacy, and a doting grandmother. Her kitchen served as the soul of their home, where the aroma of freshly baked bread mingled with the sound of laughter. The stock farm was more than just a piece of land. It was a legacy, a testament to generations of hard work and dedication. A place where life was simple, and the rhythms of nature provided comfort and continuity. The stocks stood as pillars of their community, their lives a quiet testament to the values of hard work, family, and faith. They were the kind of people who would give you the shirt off their back, always ready with a helping hand or a kind word. Their lives formed a tapestry woven with threads of love, laughter, and the simple joys of rural living. Easter Sunday of 2006 was a day of celebration for the Stock family. The sun shone brightly on the farm, casting a warm glow across the fields and the old farmhouse. The family gathered for a festive meal, the house filled with the happy chatter of children and grandchildren. It was a perfect day, one that seemed to capture everything the Stocks held dear. Family, faith, and the simple beauty of their life on the farm. As the day drew to a close and family members departed, a sense of peace settled over the farmhouse. The moon rose, casting pale, silvery light over the quiet fields. It was a night like any other, a night of quiet rest under the vast Nebraska sky. But this night would be different. This night, a shadow would fall over the stock farm, a shadow that would shatter the peace of this idyllic life forever. The next morning, the sun rose on a scene of unimaginable horror. Andrew Stock, their son, arrived at the farm to find the house eerily quiet. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach as he called out for his parents, his voice echoing through the silent house. There was no answer. He stepped inside, and the idyllic image of his family home shattered in an instant. The scene that greeted him was a nightmare from which there would be no waking. His father, Wayne, lay in the hallway, the details too horrific to describe. Petrified, Andrew stumbled back outside, his heart pounding in his chest, and fumbled for his phone to call for help. When police arrived, they found a scene of devastation. Jarman Stock was upstairs in the bedroom. Wayne had been attacked multiple times. The house had been ransacked, but nothing of significant value appeared to be missing. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that the Stocks might have known their attacker, or that the perpetrator was incredibly stealthy. The small town of Murdoch plunged into a state of shock and disbelief. The brutal murder of the Stocks, a couple so beloved and respected, was a wound that cut deep into the heart of the community. The question on everyone's lips was the same. Who could have done something so monstrous? The investigation began immediately, with the Cass County Sheriff's Office and the Nebraska State Patrol working tirelessly to find the killer. The pressure was immense. The community was terrified, and the media was in a frenzy. The police were desperate for a lead, a break in the case that would lead them to the perpetrator. Their attention soon turned to a member of the Stock family, Matthew Livers, Wayne Stock's nephew. Matt Livers was a troubled young man, 29 years old, with a history of minor scrapes with the law. There were rumors of a financial dispute between him and his aunt and uncle, whispers of bad blood that the police were quick to seize upon. Livers was brought in for questioning. He was scared and confused, a young man with a low IQ who found himself in the crosshairs of a major murder investigation. He maintained his innocence, but the police were relentless. Livers agreed to take a polygraph test, a decision he would later come to regret. He failed the test, a result that only solidified the police's suspicion. What followed was an 11-hour interrogation, a grueling ordeal that would push Livers to his breaking point. He was denied food and water, his desperate pleas of innocence echoing through empty corridors. The interrogators showed no mercy. Their questions came like a relentless storm of accusations and twisted insinuations. They painted a picture of certainty. They had evidence, they insisted. They knew he did it. It was only a matter of time before the truth would spill from his lips. Pushed to his breaking point, Exhausted, terrified, and mentally shattered, Matt Livers finally crumbled. He gave them exactly what they wanted. He confessed. But this wasn't truth. It was a carefully woven lie, a patchwork story stitched together from details the police had fed him during those grueling hours. A story that would drag down not only himself, but his cousin Nicholas Sampson as well. He painted a vivid scene, he and Sampson driving to the stock farm, taking the lives of his aunt and uncle, using Sampson's brother's car as their getaway vehicle. This confession was born from pure desperation, a false narrative forged in the crushing heat of psychological manipulation. But for the police, this was their golden moment. The case was finally cracked wide open. With that confession burning in their hands, authorities swiftly arrested both Matt Livers and Nicholas Sampson, slapping them with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The community exhaled in collective relief. The monsters responsible for this horrific crime were now locked away, caged where they belonged. But that relief wouldn't last long. Cracks began to show in their perfect story. Inconsistencies emerged like weeds through concrete. Sampson had an ironclad alibi, backed by 2 solid witnesses who could account for every moment of his time that deadly night. Then there was the glaring absence of physical evidence. Investigators tore apart the car Livers claimed they'd used, searching every inch. They found nothing. No blood, no fingerprints, no DNA connecting either man to that crime scene. Their entire case balanced precariously on a single fragile foundation, a coerced confession from a vulnerable young man whose mind had been twisted beyond recognition. The prosecution knew they were standing on quicksand. They needed something concrete, something undeniable to cement Livers and Sampson's fate. That's when David Kofod stepped into the spotlight. The commander of the Douglas County CUI division was a legend in forensic circles, a man who could solve cases that seemed impossible. Kofod went to work with surgical precision, and then, like magic, he made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden in Sampson's car, he found it, a microscopic speck of blood that he claimed belonged to Wainatak himself. It was the smoking gun they'd been desperately seeking. The case seemed rock solid once again, but there was something deeply troubling about Kofod's miraculous find. The entire CI team had already combed through that car with meticulous care. They'd found absolutely nothing. So how had Kofod managed to discover evidence that had somehow escaped everyone else's trained eyes? The defense team's suspicions were immediate, and they would soon prove to be absolutely justified. As the case crawled toward trial, a bombshell piece of evidence surfaced. Something that would detonate their carefully constructed narrative and expose a web of corruption so deep it reached the very heart of the investigation. During a second, more thorough examination of the crime scene, a sharp-eyed investigator spotted something that had been missed before. There, lying innocently on the kitchen floor, was a small gold ring. It was engraved, clearly a man's ring, and it definitely didn't belong to Wainatak. This tiny object, no bigger than a thumbnail, would become the key that unlocked a truth far more shocking and twisted than anyone could have possibly imagined. The ring was a complete mystery. Who owned it? How had it ended up at the scene of a brutal double murder in the heart of rural Nebraska? Investigators began the exhausting process of tracing its origins. They visited jewelry store after jewelry store, hoping someone might recognize that distinctive engraving. It felt like searching for a needle in an endless haystack, but it was their only real lead. Then, lightning struck. A jeweler in Wisconsin immediately recognized the ring. It was a custom piece he'd crafted and sold to a man named Gregory Fester. Gregory Fester was 19 years old, a deeply troubled teenager from Horicon, Wisconsin. His life was a tangled mess of drug abuse and petty crimes. He and his 17-year-old girlfriend, Jessica Reed, had recently launched themselves on a terrifying crime spree, a drug-fueled rampage of robbery and violence that had carved a bloody path across multiple states. Their journey of destruction had started with stealing a pickup truck and shotgun in Wisconsin. From there, they blazed a trail into Iowa, where they'd broken into 2 more homes, making off with another shotgun and whatever cash they could find. On the night of April 17th, 2006, the exact same night Wayne and Charmantak were brutally murdered. Fester and Reed were prowling through Nebraska. Investigators now had a completely different theory, one that had absolutely nothing to do with Matt Livers or Nicholas Sampson. They believed Fester and Reed were the real killers, that these two had stumbled across the stock farm during their violent spree and had murdered the couple in cold blood. It was a chilling possibility, but one supported by a mountain of growing evidence. Wisconsin police received the alert and quickly tracked down both Fester and Reed, arresting them for vehicle theft. When they searched Reed's home, they discovered something that sent ice water through their veins. A personal journal. In an entry dated April 22nd, just 5 days after the murders, Reed had written something absolutely chilling. "I took someone's life. He was older than me. The feeling, I loved it. How I wish I could experience that rush all the time." The investigation took another chilling turn when they discovered a letter Reed had written to Fester while he sat in a Wisconsin jail cell. Inside that envelope, she had tucked away a spent 12-gauge shell casing from the murders. Her words were bone-chilling. "And this bullet, well, Bunny, it's the only thing left, and I loved it. But that's something we'll talk about one day." Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. The ring, the journal, the letter. It all formed a mountain of evidence pointing straight to Fester and Reed. When investigators confronted Reed with this overwhelming evidence, she broke. She told police everything. She and Fester had been driving through Nebraska that night, their minds clouded by substances, when they made the fateful decision to break into the stock farmhouse. They'd slipped in through a window, Fester gripping a 12-gauge shotgun, Reed armed with a 410. They crept upstairs and found the Stocks sleeping peacefully in their bedroom. Fester flicked on the light, then turned to Reed, asking what they should do next. Her response was cold and simple. "Do something." Without hesitation, Fester fired, the shot tearing into Wayne Stock's leg. Wayne fought desperately for his life, but Reed raised her weapon and fired a devastating shot to his head. She would later tell police that Wayne looked directly into her eyes in those final moments before she pulled the trigger. After Wayne collapsed, Fester fired again, this time into the back of his head. Then he turned the gun on Sharman, shooting her in the face. The two killers fled into the night, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable devastation. With Reed's confession in hand, the case against Matt Livers and Nicholas Sampson completely fell apart. All charges were dropped. They walked free from jail, their names finally cleared, but their nightmare was far from over. These two innocent men had been wrongfully accused, their lives shattered by a deeply flawed investigation and fabricated evidence. They filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the investigators, alleging coercive interrogation tactics, evidence fabrication, and false arrest. The lawsuit exposed a shocking truth about David Kofod, the star CI investigator, who had supposedly discovered that crucial speck of blood in Sampson's car. It turned out Kofod had a dark history of evidence tampering. Case after case revealed a disturbing pattern of miraculous evidence appearing in high-profile investigations. He had planted the blood in Sampson's car, a desperate attempt to salvage a failing case. The man once celebrated as a forensic hero was now exposed as a complete fraud. Someone who had betrayed every principle of justice he'd sworn to uphold. David Kofod was tried and convicted of evidence tampering. The felony conviction ended his law enforcement career forever. He was sentenced to prison, a dramatic fall from grace that was both stunning and well-deserved. The county eventually settled with Livers and Sampson, awarding them millions in damages for the injustice they'd endured. But no amount of money could erase the trauma of being wrongfully accused of a crime they never committed. Jessica Reed and Gregory Fester finally faced justice for their horrific crimes. Reed pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder and received 2 consecutive life sentences. Fester was also convicted and sentenced to life behind bars. The brutal killers were finally where they belonged, and the community of Murdoch could begin the long process of healing. The murder of Wayne and Sharman Stock left an indelible scar on the heart of this small Nebraska town. It's a story of unimaginable loss, of a family destroyed by senseless violence. But it's also a story about a flawed justice system, about rushing to judgment and wrongfully accusing innocent people. This case exposed the darkest side of law enforcement, the dangers of coercive interrogations, and the terrible temptation to fabricate evidence just to close a case. The story of Sharman and Wayne Stock serves as a chilling reminder of how fragile justice can be. It underscores the vital importance of due process and the presumption of innocence. This is a story that won't soon be forgotten. It continues to echo through the quiet fields of Nebraska, whispering its cautionary tale on the prairie wind. The sun still rises over the Stock farm, but the shadows of that terrible night in April 2006 linger forever. A haunting reminder that darkness can descend upon even the most peaceful places. Story 7. In the peaceful, well-kept suburbs of Garden Grove, California, nights usually whispered with the gentle hum of sprinklers and the distant murmur of the freeway. But the pre-dawn hours of March 19, 1985, were torn apart by violence that was both deeply personal and utterly brutal. Inside a rented house on this quiet street, 23-year-old Linda Marie Brown lay sleeping. Her breath rose and fell in gentle rhythm, a delicate contrast to the darkness that had crept into her home. She was a young mother whose life bloomed with fresh possibilities, her world revolving around her infant daughter, Crystal. In just a few heartbeats, that world would be snuffed out forever. As she slept, someone pressed a gun to her chest and fired 2 shots, a muffled, final punctuation mark on a life that had barely begun to unfold. When homicide detectives arrived, they discovered a scene that was both tangled and heartbreaking. In the backyard, they found 14-year-old Cinnamon Brown, Linda's stepdaughter, lying in a doghouse. Her body limp, her clothes soaked from her body's reaction to distress. She had taken a dangerous overdose of prescription drugs. Clutched in her hand was a note tied with ribbon, a childish yet chilling confession. "Dear God," it read, "please forgive me. I didn't mean to hurt her." At first glance, the case seemed like a tragic but disturbingly simple story of family turmoil. A teenage girl, pushed to her breaking point by a difficult stepmother, had snapped, committing a desperate act of violence before trying to end her own life. It was a neat, believable story, and it was a complete and utter lie. This was a carefully crafted fiction, orchestrated by a master of deception. A man who, at that very moment, was playing the role of the grieving husband and father. David Arnold Brown. David Brown seemed like he'd stepped straight from the pages of a suburban success story. A self-made millionaire and computer genius who'd built his own thriving data recovery business. He was charismatic, intelligent, and to the outside world, a devoted family man. He'd met Linda when she was just a teenager, and she'd become his 5th wife, a beautiful young woman who'd given him another daughter, Crystal. But David Brown's life was a maze of secrets, a complex web of lies built on endless greed and a chilling need for control. His 5 marriages told the real story of how he viewed relationships. Each wife was a stepping stone, a resource to be used and then discarded when no longer needed. When police questioned him, David's story flowed seamlessly. He painted a picture of a household torn apart by constant fighting between his young wife and teenage daughter. The arguments, he said, had become unbearable. That night, exhausted by the endless bickering. He'd left the house to clear his head, a convenient alibi that placed him miles away when the murder occurred. He presented himself as a man trapped between two warring women, a tragic figure overwhelmed by domestic drama that had spiraled into violence. He wept. He grieved. He played his part flawlessly. Cinnamon, recovering from her overdose, confessed. She told police she'd killed her stepmother, that the constant fighting had driven her to it. She was charged with murder, and despite her young age, tried as an adult. In 1986, to many people's shock, this 14-year-old girl, who claimed to have committed a crime of desperation, was sentenced to 27 years to life in a California youth facility. Throughout the entire ordeal, her father stood by her side, a pillar of support, a loving father standing by his troubled, violent daughter. He'd promised her everything would be okay, that he'd get her the best lawyers, that she'd serve only a short time in juvenile detention. He'd lied about that too. But there was another key player in this dark drama, another teenager living in the house that fateful night, Patty Bailey. She was Linda's younger sister, a quiet, unassuming girl who'd moved in with the family. But Patty was more than just Linda's sister. Unknown to almost everyone, she was also David Brown's secret lover. She'd become his confidant, his ally, and ultimately, his accomplice. She was another piece in the terrible machinery of his plot. A girl seduced not just by David's charm, but by his twisted vision of a future without Linda. With Cinnamon locked away and her confession providing a tidy end to the official story, David Brown was free to enjoy the rewards of his monstrous plan. In the months before the murder, he'd taken out multiple life insurance policies on Linda, bringing the total payout to a staggering $835,000. Money was the motive, pure fuel for his greed. Within 5 months of his wife's death, he used a portion of that blood money to buy a new house, paying $350,000 in cash. He began living a life of lavish excess, his grief nothing more than a distant and unconvincing memory. In a final, breathtaking act of betrayal, he married Patty Bailey, the sister of the very woman whose murder he had orchestrated. The same young woman who had stood by and watched as his own daughter pulled the trigger. Patty became his 6th wife, her silence bought with promises of a shared future, her complicity sealed with a wedding ring. For 7 agonizing years, Cinnamon Brown wasted away in a youth detention facility, a child paying an adult's price for a crime she'd been manipulated into committing. She clung to her father's promises, her belief in his love serving as a fragile shield against the harsh reality of confinement. But as the years dragged on, as she watched from behind bars while her father lived luxuriously with her aunt, that shield began to crack. The weekly visits, the letters, the passionate declarations of love, it all started to feel hollow, like a performance meant for an audience of one. The girl who had once been willing to sacrifice everything for her father's love was finally beginning to understand something devastating. His love was poison, a tool of manipulation that had destroyed her life and ended another's. In 1988, her faith finally shattered completely. Cinnamon made a decision that would blow the case wide open. She contacted the district attorney. She was ready to tell the truth. The story she told was a chilling saga of psychological torture and diabolical manipulation. For months, David had been poisoning her mind, feeding her a steady diet of lies about Linda. He told Cinnamon that Linda was evil, that she was planning to kill him, that the only way to save him was to eliminate her first. He preyed on her love for him, on a child's desperate need to protect her parent, and he twisted that pure love into a weapon. He became her acting coach in a real-life nightmare. He taught her how to hold the gun, how to muffle the sound with a pillow, how to stage the scene, how to write the note. He had planned every detail, every contingency, his mind a cold, calculating engine of murderous intent. He had convinced 2 teenage girls, his own daughter and his sister-in-law, that they were participating in a righteous act of self-defense. In reality, they were simply pawns in his greedy, sociopathic game. Patty, now married to David and living the life that Linda's death had paid for, was arrested. Faced with Cinnamon's confession, her own wall of silence crumbled. She admitted her role in the plot, her testimony providing devastating confirmation of everything Cinnamon had revealed. She had been David's lover, his accomplice, a girl who had watched her own sister be murdered, then married the man who had orchestrated it all. But the true, terrifying extent of David Brown's depravity was yet to be revealed. While sitting in jail waiting trial, his mind, ever the plotter, was already working on a sequel. He believed that if he could eliminate the key witnesses against him, he could still walk free. He began hatching a new plot, a plan to have Patty, the lead prosecutor, and another key investigator eliminated. He confided in a fellow inmate, unaware that the man was a jailhouse informant, now wearing a wire for police. The authorities listened in stunned disbelief as David calmly discussed the details of these new murders, his voice devoid of emotion, his words the cold, hard calculations of a man who saw other human beings as mere obstacles to be removed. In a final chilling sting operation, police arranged for the informant, now released, to call David and tell him the murders had been carried out. "Wonderful," David said, his voice recorded for all to hear. "You did great." The monster had not just been unmasked. He had given a command performance, a final, damning monologue that sealed his fate. In 1990, David Arnold Brown was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The jury had seen the man behind the mask, the puppet master who had pulled the strings of 2 young women in his life. They found him guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence ensuring he would never again be free to manipulate, betray, and kill. For their cooperation, both Cinnamon and Patty received reduced sentences. Cinnamon, the girl who had taken the fall and lost her childhood, was paroled after serving 7 years. She emerged from the darkness of her past with courage that's almost impossible to comprehend. She rebuilt her life. She changed her name and dedicated herself to helping others, becoming a voice for the abused and manipulated. She had been a victim of one of the most diabolical plots in modern criminal history, but she refused to be defined by it. Patty Bailey, after serving her time, also faded back into anonymity, her name forever linked to a story of betrayal and twisted love. The case of Linda Brown became a sensation, a story so bizarre, so full of love, lies and murder that it captivated the nation. David Brown, the man at the center of it all, died of natural causes in a prison hospital in 2014. His death was a quiet, unremarkable end to a life of extraordinary evil. He left behind a trail of devastation, a family torn apart by his insatiable greed and monstrous ego. Yet from this darkness emerged something powerful, a story of survival. Crystal, the baby who had been in that house the night her mother's life was taken, found refuge with Linda's loving family. She grew up carrying the weight of her mother's tragic end, but also embraced by the warmth of her memory. Linda Brown's story takes us deep into the chilling mind of a sociopath. It shows us how love can be twisted into a deadly weapon, and how youthful innocence can fall prey to the calculated schemes of a master manipulator. This haunting tale serves as a stark reminder that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding in dark corners. They're the ones walking among us every day, flashing perfect smiles, radiating charm, and concealing their true nature behind masks so convincing that we never see them come. Story 8. The neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital was a world unto itself. A hushed, brightly lit sanctuary where the most fragile of lives fought for their very first breaths. This was a place of gentle beeping machines and whispered reassurances, where parents, their faces carved with hope and fear, kept watch over tiny incubators. Here, miracles unfolded every single day. The nurses who worked within these sacred walls were seen as angels of mercy, their skilled hands and compassionate hearts guiding premature and sick infants from the edge of existence into the warm embrace of their parents' arms. Into this world of delicate balances stepped Lucy Letby. Born in Hereford, the only child of a furniture salesman and an accounts clerk, she seemed, by all accounts, perfectly ordinary. Friends described her as kind and gentle, someone who had always dreamed of caring for babies, a dream she pursued with unwavering dedication. She was the first in her family to attend university, earning her degree in child nursing from the University of Chester in 2011. The following year, she secured a coveted position as a registered nurse in the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester, the very place where she had trained as a student. She appeared to be everything a model nurse should be. A 2013 staff profile featured her smiling face, where she spoke warmly about the joy she found in watching babies' progress and supporting their families. She even threw herself into fundraising campaigns for a new, state-of-the-art neonatal unit. Colleagues saw her as dedicated and hardworking, always willing to take on extra shifts, particularly in the intensive care rooms where the most vulnerable babies received care. She seemed to thrive in that high-stakes environment, telling others she found the less intensive work boring. To the anxious parents who entrusted their newborns to her care, she was a reassuring presence, a calm, capable figure in a sea of medical uncertainty. No one could have known that behind that gentle smile and compassionate facade, a darkness was taking root, a malevolence so profound it would shatter the sanctity of the neonatal unit and send shockwaves through the entire nation. The trouble began in June of 2015, just over 3 years after Letby started working on the unit. It started subtly, a disturbing ripple in the steady rhythm of the ward. The neonatal unit, which typically saw only 2 or 3 infant deaths in an entire year, suddenly experienced a horrifying spike. In the space of just a few weeks, 3 babies died. Another suffered a life-threatening collapse. The deaths were sudden, unexpected, and most unnervingly, unexplained. The first was a baby boy known in court as Child A, a twin born prematurely, but in good health. On the evening of June 8th, just 24 hours after his birth, he suddenly deteriorated. Letby was his designated nurse. Despite frantic resuscitation efforts, he died. The cause remained elusive. The very next night, his twin sister, Child B, also collapsed. She, too, was under Letby's care. This time, the medical team managed to save her, but the incident left everyone deeply unsettled. Less than a week later, another baby boy, Child C, died. He had been born with a lung condition but was stable. Then, without warning, he collapsed. Letby had been on duty. The unit, once a place of quiet hope, now felt thick with unspoken fear. The staff were baffled and distressed. This cluster of deaths and collapses was statistically improbable, a grim anomaly that defied medical explanation. Dr. Stephen Brary, the lead consultant on the unit, initiated an informal review. He noticed a disturbing pattern. Lucy Letby had been on duty during every single incident. At the time, he dismissed it as coincidence. Letby was one of only a few nurses qualified to work in intensive care, and often picked up extra shifts, so her presence wasn't entirely surprising. Nobody had any concerns about her practice, he would later state. The hospital management, when informed, also deemed the spike in deaths a tragic coincidence, possibly linked to medication errors. No significant action was taken, but the deaths continued. On June 22nd, Child D, a full-term baby girl, died just 36 hours after her birth. Again, Letby was present. The staff's unease grew into a palpable sense of dread. The unit felt cursed, haunted by a shadow they couldn't name. The summer of 2015 wore on, bringing with it more tragedy. In early August, twin boys, Child E and Child F, were admitted to the unit. On August 4th, Child E died suddenly. The following day, his twin brother, Child F, became critically ill with dangerously low blood sugar levels, but managed to pull through. During the subsequent police investigation, doctors would discover something highly unusual in the blood test results for Child F and another infant, Child Ball, evidence of insulin poisoning. The prosecution would later call this their smoking gun. The mother of Child E would later testify to a chilling encounter. She had heard her baby scream and walked in to find him with blood around his mouth. Letby was in the room, calmly explaining away the blood as nothing more than a feeding tube issue. "Trust me, I'm a nurse," she told the distraught mother. Hours later, the baby was dead. What prosecutors would later call intrusive curiosity drove Letby to send a sympathy card to the grieving parents on the very day of their son's funeral. But first, she photographed the card on her phone. She also hunted down the families of her victims on Facebook, searching for them on the anniversaries of their babies' deaths, even on Christmas Day. The prosecution would describe this behavior as hunting for grief. By early 2016, the consultants on the unit, led by Dr. Breyer and his colleague Dr. Ravi Jayaram, could no longer dismiss these tragedies as coincidence. Their suspicions had crystallized into a terrible certainty. The common thread running through this string of heartbreak wasn't a flaw in the hospital's systems or some mysterious virus. It was a person. It was Lucy Letby. Dr. Jayaram would later describe a chilling moment when he walked into a nursery to find an infant's oxygen levels plummeting dangerously. Letby stood by the incubator, doing absolutely nothing. The moment he stepped in, the baby's condition improved. He felt certain he had just interrupted an attempted murder. The doctors raised their concerns again and again with hospital management, demanding that Letby be removed from patient care while a full investigation took place. Their pleas hit a wall of resistance and dismissal. They were told not to make a fuss, that they shouldn't really be saying such things. Hospital executives seemed far more worried about protecting their reputation than investigating the possibility of a killer in their midst. In a move that would later draw fierce criticism, the hospital board sided with Letby in January 2017 when she filed a grievance. They decided her removal from the unit had been orchestrated by the consultants without hard evidence. The chief executive even apologized to Letby and her parents, then ordered the doctors to write her an apology letter. Under duress, they complied in February 2017. The consultants found themselves trapped in an impossible situation. They were convinced a murderer was stalking their ward, but their superiors refused to listen. The breaking point came in June 2016. Letby had just returned from a holiday in Ibiza. Within days, 2 triplet boys, Child O and Child P, died on consecutive shifts. Dr. Breyer, at his wit's end, called the duty executive and demanded Letby be taken off the unit immediately. Once again, the request was refused. Only after another baby nearly died the following day was Letby finally moved to a desk job in the hospital's risk and patient safety office at the end of June 2016. The moment she left the neonatal unit, the mysterious deaths and collapses stopped completely. Frustrated and stonewalled by their own management, the consultants took an extraordinary step. They went directly to the police. In May 2017, Cheshire Constabulary launched an investigation codenamed Operation Hummingbird. For an entire year, detectives meticulously combed through the medical records of every baby who had died or collapsed on the unit during Letby's time there. They brought in medical experts, including a retired pediatrician named Dr. Dewey Evans, who would become the prosecution's lead expert witness. On July 3, 2018, the investigation reached its dramatic climax. Police descended on Lucy Letby's neat semi-detached house near the hospital. The angel of the neonatal unit was arrested on suspicion of 8 counts of murder and 6 counts of attempted murder. The news sent shockwaves through Chester and beyond. Searches of her home revealed a treasure trove of disturbing evidence. Police discovered hundreds of confidential medical documents stuffed under her bed and hidden in closets. Nursing handover sheets, resuscitation records for the babies she had allegedly harmed. Letby claimed she was simply a messy collector of paperwork, but the sheer volume suggested something far more sinister, a morbid obsession with her victims. Even more damning were her handwritten notes, scrawled on post-it notes and loose scraps of paper. They painted a chaotic picture of despair and what seemed like confession. "I don't deserve to live. I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough to care for them," one note read. Another declared simply, "I am evil. I did this." Other fragments were more puzzling. "I haven't done anything wrong. And I don't know if I killed them. Maybe I did. Maybe this is all down to me." The defense would argue these were the tortured thoughts of a woman in mental anguish, written under the crushing stress of being investigated. The prosecution, however, saw them as the closest thing they had to a direct confession. The trial of Lucy Letby began at Manchester Crown Court on October 10th, 2022. It would become one of the longest and most complex murder trials in British history, stretching on for more than 9 months. Letby stood in the dock, a seemingly ordinary woman in her early 30s, and pleaded not guilty to 7 counts of murder and 15 counts of attempted murder. The prosecution, led by Nick Johnson KC, began laying out their case with chilling precision. They argued that Letby, for reasons known only to herself, had embarked on a cruel, calculated, and cynical campaign of child murder. The prosecution alleged she used a variety of methods, all of which were difficult to detect. She stood accused of introducing air into babies' veins or stomachs, causing devastating complications, harming 2 infants with insulin, and overfeeding others with milk. These were subtle, insidious acts, harms that could easily be mistaken for the natural complications of premature birth. The prosecution presented a staffing chart showing Letby was the one constant presence during all the suspicious collapses and deaths. Through simple elimination, they argued, she must be responsible. Dr. Dewey Evans and other medical experts for the prosecution testified that the pattern of injuries and sudden, unexplained deteriorations weren't consistent with natural causes. They pointed to unusual skin discoloration on some babies as evidence of air-related complications. They highlighted the abnormal insulin levels in 2 others as proof of deliberate harm. They painted a picture of a cunning and deceptive individual, someone who used her specialist knowledge to cause harm and then cover her tracks. They even alleged she falsified medical records to distance herself from the events. The defense, led by Ben Myers KC, mounted a robust challenge. They portrayed Letby as a dedicated nurse being scapegoated for systemic failures within a busy hospital neonatal unit, one that was understaffed and struggling with poor hygiene standards. Myers argued that the prosecution's case was built on assumption that someone was deliberately causing harm, combined with the coincidence of Letby's presence. He insisted the deaths were tragic but not criminal. They were the result of massive care failures far too great to blame on one person. The defense fiercely contested the medical evidence, arguing that the air-related theory was weak and that alternative explanations existed for the baby's collapses. They pointed to plumbing issues that led to sewage backing up in the unit's sinks as a potential source of infection. When Letby herself took the stand, she appeared tearful and overwhelmed, denying all allegations. She claimed she had meant no harm and that the accusations had destroyed her mental health. She offered mundane explanations for her disturbing behavior, saying she searched for victims' families on Facebook out of general curiosity, and that she had simply forgotten to destroy the medical records she took home. Under cross-examination, however, her composure reportedly frayed. She contradicted herself on several points. On August 18th, 2023, after 22 days of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdicts. Lucy Ledby was found guilty of the murders of 7 babies and the attempted murders of 6 others. She was acquitted of 2 attempted murder charges, and the jury could not reach verdicts on 6 further counts. 3 days later, Mr. Justice Goss handed down the sentence. Ledby refused to leave her cell to attend the hearing, a final act of defiance that prompted widespread outrage and calls for a change in the law to compel convicted criminals to face their victims' families in court. In her absence, the judge sentenced her to a whole life order, the most severe penalty in the British legal system, reserved for the most heinous of crimes. She would die in prison. There was a deep malevolence bordering on sadism in your actions, the judge said, addressing the empty dock. You have no remorse. There are no mitigating factors. Ledby became only the 4th woman in UK legal history to receive such a sentence. The conviction, however, was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of a new, deeply contentious chapter. Even as Ledby was being transferred to a maximum security prison, a growing number of medical experts, statisticians, and legal commentators began to raise serious questions about the safety of her convictions. The controversy centered on the medical evidence, which had been almost entirely circumstantial. There was no direct evidence, no eyewitness who saw Ledby harm a child. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the expert opinion of Dr. Dewey Evans and his interpretation of the clinical data. This interpretation was now coming under intense scrutiny. The case of Lucy Ledby has become a deeply polarizing national event. For the families of the victims and the prosecution, she is a monstrous, manipulative killer who preyed on the most vulnerable and betrayed every tenet of her profession. Her convictions were the result of a painstaking investigation and a thorough trial. The sentence of a whole life order was just and necessary. But for a growing chorus of critics, she is the victim of a terrible miscarriage of justice. A single nurse wrongly blamed for systemic failures and convicted on the basis of flawed and contested expert opinion. As of late 2024, the Crown Prosecution Service is considering bringing further charges against Ledby related to other suspicious incidents, even as the CSIRC weighs the application to have her convictions reviewed. The Thorwall inquiry is set to unveil its findings in early 2026, promising to illuminate the institutional breakdowns that enabled such a devastating tragedy to unfold. Lucy Ledby's story is far from reaching its conclusion. It lingers as a raw, unhealed wound, a deeply disturbing tale that compels us to face uncomfortable truths about our justice system's imperfections, the immense influence of expert testimony, and the chilling reality that the boundary between a healing angel and a harbinger of death can be frighteningly razor-thin. Story 9. The chill of a mid-November morning in North Carolina clung to the damp earth like a warning. It was the kind of cold that crept deep into your bones, a whisper of the bitter winter yet to come. For 6 long days, the search had consumed everything. Hundreds of volunteers combed through fields and forests. Officers worked around the clock, their faces growing more grim with each passing hour. Everyone held on to the same fragile hope, the same whispered prayer carried on the autumn wind. But on this morning, the 6th day since she had vanished, that prayer finally died. Deep in a desolate patch of woods off Highway 87, in a place local hunters knew all too well, the search reached its heartbreaking end. There, hidden among tangled kudzu vines and scattered fallen leaves, lay the small, still form of a child. She had been left there like a discarded toy, her bright spirit forever silenced in the lonely quiet of the forest. The discovery confirmed what the entire town of Fayetteville, North Carolina, had been dreading for a week. Shania Davis, a 5-year-old girl whose smile could light up any room, was gone forever. The Amber Alert that had blazed across the state, that desperate digital plea for a miracle, would now fall silent. The search was over. But the story of how she came to be in that desolate place was just beginning to unravel. revealing a darkness far deeper and more chilling than the woods themselves. Fayetteville, North Carolina, in the autumn of 2009, was a city caught between two worlds. Home to Fort Bragg, one of the largest military installations in the world, it hummed with the disciplined energy of soldiers and the quiet strength of their families. Neat suburban streets stretched for miles, filled with the steady rhythm of military life. But beyond that orderly world, another reality existed, a place of constant movement, economic struggle, and the shadows that always seemed to gather in such spaces. It was in this in-between world, in a faded mobile home park called Sleepy Hollow, that Shania Davis's story took its darkest turn. Shania was a child caught between two very different worlds. For most of her young life, her anchor had been her father, Bradley Lockhart. By every account, he was a man who absolutely adored his daughter. Their life together was steady and secure, filled with all the simple joys of childhood. He had custody of Shania, creating a safe harbor away from the chaos that often swirled around her mother, Antoinette Davis. Shania was such a bright, happy child, her Aunt Carrie Lockhart would later remember. A little girl who loved her mother deeply, despite all the instability that love brought with it. Antoinette lived a completely different kind of life. At 25, she was already a mother of two, struggling to keep her head above water in a world that seemed determined to pull her under. She drifted from place to place, her life a chaotic dance with poverty and poor choices that seemed to multiply with each passing day. In November 2009, she and her two children, Shania and her 7-year-old brother, were living in the cramped front room of a trailer in Sleepy Hollow. They shared the tiny space with her sister Brenda Davis and her family. The Department of Social Services had been in contact with the family before, a fact that would later come under intense scrutiny. But for now, they remained on the edges of a storm that was quietly gathering strength. On October 9th, 2009, about a month before the end, Antoinette called with a simple request. She wanted to see her daughter. Shania, who missed her mother terribly, was thrilled at the chance to visit. Her Aunt Carrie drove her over that day, a simple act of family kindness that would replay in her mind with agonizing clarity for years to come. I took Shania over there and gave her a kiss goodbye and told her to be a good girl, she remembered. As the little girl ran toward her mother, she turned back for just a moment, her small voice calling out, "I love you, Aunt Carrie. I'll see you later." Those were the last words her father's family would ever hear her speak. Bradley Lockhart, trusting that a mother would naturally care for her child, agreed to let Shania stay with Antoinette for what he believed would be just a visit. Antoinette never lived in the best neighborhoods, and of course there was always that concern, he would later admit. But I was never concerned about her caring for Shania as a mother. This trust, born from hope that a mother's love would be shield enough, was tragically misplaced. In the month that followed, Shania was pulled deeper and deeper into the whirlpool of her mother's world. And that world included a man named Mario Andre McNeil. At 29, McNeil was a familiar figure in Fayetteville's darker corners. He carried a criminal record and a reputation that should have served as a blazing warning to anyone who crossed his path. But he was also familiar with Antoinette's family in ways that made him even more dangerous. He had previously dated her sister Brenda, and had even helped pay the deposit for the very trailer where Antoinette and her children were now staying. He knew the layout of that mobile home like the back of his hand. He knew how to get inside, even when the doors were locked. He was a ghost from a troubled past, about to become the architect of an unthinkable nightmare. The night of November 9th, 2009, bled slowly into the early morning hours of November 10th in a haze of substances and desperation. Mario McNeil, his judgment clouded by a dangerous mix of drugs and alcohol, began sending out a series of text messages, casting a digital net, searching for female companionship. He tried to contact Brenda Davis first, but her phone was turned off. He arranged to meet another woman who also lived in Sleepy Hollow, but she had fallen asleep before he arrived. At 3:06 a.m., he sent her a simple text, "Good night." His search for connection had come to nothing, but his night was far from over. Inside the trailer, Antoinette Davis found herself trapped in a nightmare of her own making. She owed a drug debt, just $200. In her world, that small sum felt like a mountain she couldn't climb. The pressure was crushing her, and she was completely out of options. What happened next defies all understanding. In a decision that would forever brand her, not as a mother, but as a monster in the eyes of the world, she chose to settle that debt. The currency she decided to use was her own daughter. We'll never know exactly what words were spoken in those dark moments before the transaction. Those details remain locked away in the memories of the two people who orchestrated it. But the outcome? That's brutally, horrifically clear. In a confession to police that was chillingly detached, Antoinette Davis would later lay out the terms of the deal with a simplicity that made the horror even worse. She just gave her away for $200, she said. They were just supposed to have sex. In the pre-dawn darkness, McNeil approached the trailer. We don't know if he stepped inside or if Antoinette brought Shania out to him. But somewhere in those shadows, a small sleeping child was transferred from what should have been the safety of her mother's care into the arms of a predator. The exchange was made. A debt was paid. A life was sold. Hours later, as the sun rose over Fayetteville, Antoinette Davis picked up her phone and dialed 911. She reported her daughter Shania as missing. She told the dispatcher she had put her children to bed the night before, and when she woke up, her 5-year-old was gone. The lie was the final betrayal, a cowardly attempt to hide an unspeakable act. And so began the search for Shania Davis. But from the very first moment, it was a search built on deception, a race against a clock that had already run out. The initial report sent shockwaves through the Fayetteville Police Department. A 5-year-old girl seemingly vanished from her bed in the dead of night. When a child goes missing, every second counts, and resources were immediately mobilized. The story Antoinette told was every parent's worst nightmare. She'd last seen her daughter around 5:30 a.m. She claimed. When she checked again, the front door was ajar and Shania was gone. The first 24 hours became a blur of desperate activity. Officers canvassed Sleepy Hollow Mobile Home Park, knocking on doors, searching the surrounding woods. Their questions were met with a mixture of concern and fear from residents who couldn't believe something like this could happen in their community. An Amber Alert was issued, sending Shania's smiling school picture across the state. Her name and description flashed on highway signs and television screens. She was described as a black female, approximately 3 feet tall and 40 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes. The alert became a beacon of hope, a call to a million eyes to watch for a little girl in her pajamas. But as the investigation deepened, something didn't feel right. Inconsistencies in Antoinette's story began to emerge. Her timeline kept shifting under questioning. Her behavior struck investigators as oddly detached for a mother whose child was missing. The focus, which had initially been on finding an unknown kidnapper, began to slowly, cautiously turn toward the family itself. A break seemed to come from a witness who reported seeing a man leaving the trailer park with a child in his car. This led police to a man named Clarence Company, who was arrested on kidnapping charges. It looked promising, but it quickly became a dead end. Co wasn't their man. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A hotel in Sanford, a town about 40 miles north of Fayetteville. An employee at the Comfort Suites Hotel saw the Amber Alert and recognized the little girl. They contacted police with information that would blow the case wide open. Hotel surveillance video, time-stamped at 6:11 a.m. On Tuesday, November 10th, before Antoinette had even reported her daughter missing, showed a man carrying a small child down a hallway. The child was unmistakably Shania Davis. The man was identified as Mario Andret McNeil. The footage was grainy, but the image was devastatingly clear. McNeil walked down that hallway with chilling purpose, carrying a child who hung limply in his arms. He held her not with the tenderness of a father, but with the grim possessiveness of a captor. This single piece of evidence changed everything. It transformed the case from a mysterious abduction into a manhunt for a known suspect. The connection between McNeil and Shania's family wasn't immediately known to the public, but for investigators, the puzzle pieces were falling into a horrifying picture. With McNeil identified as the man in the video, the Amber Alert was updated and upgraded to a nationwide search. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing federal resources to bear on what had become a frantic race against time. Bradley Lockhart, Shania's distraught father, made a desperate public plea. His voice trembled with raw emotion as he faced the cameras, speaking directly to his missing daughter and the person who had taken her from him. "Shania, if you are listening to Daddy, I miss you so much. I'm not going to give up," he pleaded, his words cutting through the silence like a desperate prayer. But while search parties spread across the countryside, investigators were peeling back the layers of a much darker truth. The story about drug deaths began to surface, and all eyes turned to Antoinette Davis. On November 14th, 4 days after she had reported her daughter missing, Antoinette found herself sitting in a cold police interrogation room. She was pregnant, emotionally shattered, and suddenly she wasn't being treated as a grieving mother anymore. She was a suspect. Detectives leaned in hard, pushing her to choose the right path. Her defense team would later claim she was coerced, that police had promised she could simply walk away if she just gave them something, anything. In that sterile room, crushed under the weight of her guilt and the relentless pressure, everything finally crumbled. She broke down and admitted her role in the unthinkable tragedy, speaking the words that confirmed every investigator's worst nightmare. She had sold her daughter for $200. The next day, Antoinette Nicole Davis was arrested and charged with human trafficking, felony child abuse, and prostitution-related offenses. The arrest of a mother for selling her own child sent shockwaves across the nation. This was no longer just a kidnapping case. This was a story of betrayal beyond imagination. But one desperate question still hung in the air. Where was Shania? Antoinette Davis's arrest cast a dark shadow over the search efforts. The hope for a joyful reunion slowly twisted into something much more grim. Now investigators had one focus: finding Mario McNeil. He was the only person who knew where Shania was, the only one holding the key to ending this agonizing nightmare. On November 13th, 3 days after the abduction, McNeil was taken into custody. He admitted to kidnapping the little girl. A partial confession that placed him at the scene but left the most crucial questions hanging in the air. He was initially charged with kidnapping, but he refused to reveal what had happened to Shania, or where she might be found. For investigators, it felt like hitting a brick wall. They had their suspect locked up, but the little girl was still out there somewhere. As McNeil sat in his jail cell, his family hired attorney Alan Rogers to represent him. Facing the terrifying possibility of a capital murder charge, McNeil began opening up to his lawyer. What he revealed was protected by attorney-client privilege, one of the most sacred principles in our legal system. But McNeil's confession to his legal team created an impossible ethical dilemma. He told them that Shania was dead, and he told them exactly where he had left her body. His lawyers now faced a heart-wrenching choice. Their duty was to protect their client's rights and provide him with the strongest defense possible. But they also held information that could bring some measure of closure to a grieving family and a community in anguish. They decided to act, believing they had secured an agreement with prosecutors that the information wouldn't be used against their client. a deal that prosecutors would later deny ever existed. McNeil's lawyers approached the authorities with a map, directing investigators to a remote wooded area off Highway 87, near the border between Lee and Harnett counties. On Monday, November 16, 2009, law enforcement followed that map. The search, which had sprawled across miles of desperate hope, now narrowed to a single terrible location. As officers and search teams moved through the woods, you could feel the dread hanging heavy in the air. About 100 feet off the road, hidden in a patch of undergrowth, they found her. The discovery of Shania's body sent waves of profound sorrow rippling through the entire state. Captain Mark Benjamin of the Fayetteville Police, a veteran officer who had seen it all, would later call it the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my career. The hope that had kept the community going for 6 long days was snuffed out in an instant, replaced by a cold, unforgiving grief. The state medical examiner's office conducted an autopsy, and the findings were brutal and clear. Dr. Thomas Clark testified that Shania had suffered terrible injuries that were most likely inflicted before her death. The cause of death wasn't strangulation, as initially suspected, but asphyxiation. She had been smothered. Based on the state of decomposition, the medical examiner estimated her body had been in those woods for about a week, meaning she was likely killed on the very same day she was taken. With the discovery of the body and the autopsy results, the charges against Mario McNeil were upgraded dramatically. He now faced first-degree murder, first-degree rape of a child, and a host of other charges related to kidnapping and sexual servitude. He was now a man staring down the death penalty. During his court appearance for these new charges, District Court Judge George Franks spelled out the harsh reality of his situation. "You're charged with first-degree murder in the state of North Carolina. That's punishable by the death penalty or life imprisonment without parole." McNeil was quickly moved to Raleigh Central Prison, placed under suicide watch for his own protection. The heartbreaking case of Shania Davis had finally reached its devastating end. A little girl who simply loved her mother was gone forever. The mother who betrayed that love sat behind bars, and the man who bought, brutalized, and killed her now faced a trial that could cost him his life. The search had ended, but the fight for justice was only just beginning. The legal aftermath of Shania Davis's murder would unfold along 2 separate yet deeply connected paths. The first would focus on the mother who made an unthinkable choice to sell her own child. The second would target the man who carried out the unspeakable acts that followed. Both cases would play out in a Cumberland County courtroom, under the harsh glare of national media attention, and the watchful eyes of a community crying out for justice. Antoinette Davis remained an enigma. During her court appearances, she often seemed completely detached, a blank canvas that revealed nothing of whatever storm might be raging inside her. But when she tearfully apologized to Shania's father, Bradley Lockhart, she suddenly became the image of a broken mother, crushed by circumstances beyond her control. "I never claimed to be a perfect mother, but I was a good mother," she insisted. "I did what I had to do to provide." It was a statement that clashed violently with the horrific facts of the case. Her defense team fought hard to keep her confession out of court, arguing that police had used manipulative tactics on a woman who was pregnant, sick, and emotionally shattered. They claimed detectives had made her believe that her freedom depended on admitting to something, anything. But the judge wasn't buying it. Judge Jim Ammons ruled there was no evidence of threats, noting that Davis had been clearly told she was free to leave the interview at any time. Her confession, that damning admission of selling her daughter, would stand as evidence, staring down a first-degree murder trial and the very real possibility of life in prison without parole. Antoinette Davis and her legal team decided to cut a deal. On October 17, 2013, she stood before Judge Ammons and entered an Alford plea. Under North Carolina law, this was like walking a legal tightrope. She didn't admit guilt, but she acknowledged that prosecutors had enough evidence to likely win a conviction. She pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder, along with first-degree kidnapping, sexual servitude of a child, and human trafficking. Before handing down her sentence, Judge Ammons delivered a blistering condemnation. "You had the opportunity, the means to save Shania's life, and you did not," he told her directly. "You are not a good mother." Radley Lockhart, the father whose trust she had shattered, was also there in the courtroom. In a moment of almost unbelievable grace, he chose to offer forgiveness. "I forgave you a long time ago, and Shania did too," he said. His words stood as a testament to a spirit that grief could not destroy. Antoinette Davis received a sentence of 5 to 21 years in prison. For such an unthinkable crime, many felt the punishment seemed surprisingly light, but it reflected a calculated legal strategy that kept her from spending life behind bars. She was led away to serve her time, a living reminder of the ultimate betrayal a mother could commit. Her later appeal of the conviction was denied. Mario McNeil's journey toward justice proved far more complicated, filled with legal battles at every turn. Unlike Antoinette, he refused to make any deals. He continued claiming his innocence even as the mountain of evidence against him grew higher. His trial began in April 2013. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Billy West, methodically built their case piece by devastating piece. They presented hotel surveillance footage, DNA evidence found on Shania's body, and witness testimony placing McNeil in Sleepy Hollow the night of the abduction. The state offered McNeil one final chance: plead guilty to first-degree murder, and they'd remove the death penalty from the table, leaving him with life in prison. McNeil refused. His defense team launched an aggressive, multi-front attack. They argued that McNeil's original lawyers had violated attorney-client privilege by revealing where Shania's body could be found, and that all evidence stemming from that discovery should be thrown out. The judge denied their motion, ruling there was no evidence of any binding agreement with the state. The defense also tried pointing fingers elsewhere, exposing a bizarre and twisted web of relationships. McNeil had actually dated Shania's aunt for 3 months before the murder. They even claimed that images found on McNeil's phone were of the aunt, not another minor, desperately trying to get separate child exploitation charges dismissed. The trial became a grim, emotionally devastating ordeal. When jurors were shown autopsy photos, some of Shania's relatives fled the courtroom in tears. The defense objected, but was overruled. The weight of evidence was simply crushing. In May 2013, after deliberating for less than an hour, the jury found Mario McNeil guilty of first-degree murder, first-degree assault of a child, and first-degree kidnapping. The trial then moved to its final, most crucial phase. The same jury that had found him guilty would now hold his very life in their hands, deciding between life behind bars or death. In what seemed like a final act of defiance, or perhaps complete resignation, McNeil made a stunning choice. He refused to present any evidence that might save his life. He simply wouldn't fight for it. Once again, the jury didn't need long to make up their minds. On May 29, 2013, their verdict rang out clear. Mario McNeil should be sentenced to death. But McNeil's legal battles were far from over. He fought back through appeals, claiming his lawyers had failed him and his rights had been trampled. In 2018, the North Carolina Supreme Court took up his case. His new legal team argued with fierce determination that he deserved another chance, that his original attorneys had completely betrayed his trust. The court remained unmoved. They stood firm, upholding both his conviction and death sentence. In their eyes, he had received a fair trial. Today, Mario McNeil sits on death row, waiting as the final chapter of his story remains unwritten. The convictions of Antoinette Davis and Mario McNeil brought some measure of legal justice to the tragedy that was Shania Davis. But the wounds carved by her death cut deep, reaching far beyond any courtroom walls. Her case became a chilling warning, a stark reminder of the evil that can lurk right under our noses. Shania's story isn't just about one monstrous act, the brutal taking of a child's life. It's also about the quieter, more insidious darkness that creates the path for such horrors. The crushing weight of poverty, the stranglehold of addiction, systems that fail when they're needed most, and perhaps most terrifying of all, the devastating void that opens when a mother's love simply isn't enough. This is the story of a 5-year-old girl, sold for the price of a drug fix, carried into darkness by a man who left her alone in the woods. She was someone's daughter, someone's niece, someone's friend. Her name was Shania, and she deserved so much more than the world gave her. Her story, in all its heartbreaking detail, demands that we don't turn away. It's a solemn promise that she will never be forgotten.